Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just check that everybody can hear me and see me? Yes, right, thank you. Now the time is now 9:30 and the hearing into the examination of the Brentwood local plan is resumed. Now, yesterday I did do a full sort of opening statement, and I won't be repeating all of that this morning, but I will provide a short summary as some additional participants are here today that weren't present yesterday. Now, my name is Yvonne Wright, and myself and my colleague, Mr. Mike Warden, who will just introduce himself.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. We've both been jointly appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to hold this examination into the legality and soundness of the plan and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations on these matters. As you're fully aware, Annette Feeney is the Programme Officer and is responsible for all administrative and procedural arrangements for the examination. There she is. Any questions or queries, please contact Annette directly. And just a reminder that all information is available on the examination webpage and any necessary updates will be posted there, so please keep an eye on that. In relation to the hearing sessions, you will have read our guidance notes, particularly our virtual guidance notes. And just a reminder, please, that your microphone should be on mute unless you're invited to speak. Preference would be for cameras to be on because it's actually easier to talk to somebody if cameras are on. However, if there are issues or you prefer not to have your camera on, that's okay. But please ensure that your microphone is on mute. That helps to ensure that prevents disturbance from background noises, etc. Can I also remind you that all mobile phones and electronic devices that you're not using for the virtual event, please can they be either switched off or on silent when we are in session, and please also remember to turn them off again when you come back from any breaks if you've have used them. If during the sessions you wish to contribute to the discussions, if you can raise your hand, if you have that function. If not, if you can wave to me, obviously with your camera on, otherwise I can't see you, then somebody will alert me to your that you have a question or you have a query that you would like to discuss in the session. So please do that. And just again, a reminder that this week we are focusing on legal and strategic matters. So more detailed matters on site allocations and the specific policy wording, although we will be talking about some policies today, but the vast majority of the detailed policy wording will be discussed later in later hearing sessions. And so on that point as well, there will be no discussions on any emission sites. We're not here to consider sites that are not in the plan. We will inevitably discuss different land areas. That's going to happen when considering the spatial strategy today in particular, potentially, and we discussed it yesterday as part of the sustainability appraisal, etc. So there could be an element of discussion of that, but please don't see that as an invitation to discuss a specific emission site because it is not. In terms of timings today, we are proposing to have a break mid-morning, usually around 11 o'clock. That's usually for about half an hour. We will break for lunch between 1 and 2 and then commence again at 2 o'clock. Now, this session is not ending at all, so at lunchtime don't sign out because it will just be continuing. Well, if we need this afternoon, that is, we'll see how the discussion goes. I'm not anticipating that this session will go on for too long this afternoon if it does go into this afternoon, so it may well be an earlier session. Does anybody have any questions about the processes and procedures that I've just highlighted there, or anything that's in our guidance notes? No. Okay, thank you. Now, as with all sessions, what I'd like to do is start with introductions, please, from the participants who are here today. If I can start with the council, please.
Yes, good morning, ma'am. My name is Paul Shadarivian, Queen's Counsel, acting for Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy, Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector. It's Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Borough Council.
Good morning, Kay Polaris, Brentwood Borough Council. Good morning, inspectors. My name is Tom Huang, Brentwood Borough Council Senior Policy Planner.
Thank you. And Mr. Shadaravian, do you have your sustainability appraisal consultants available in case we need them?
We do indeed,
Is
Mum.
that correct? Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. And do we have Basildon Borough Council present today?
Yes, good morning. I'm Robert Davey from Basildon Council.
Thank you, Mr. Davey. And Catesby Estates.
Yes, Dawn Adams representing Catesby Estates.
Lovely, thank you. And CEG.
Good morning. James Fennell, Chief Executive of Lichfields, acting for CEG Land Promotions.
Thank you. And Constable Homes.
Good morning, everyone. Inspectors, this is Stephen Butler from Bidwells, representing Constable Homes, an operating subsidiary of the Anderson Group.
Thank you very much. Crudace Homes.
Good morning. I'm Jane Piper from Barton Wilmore, representing Crudace Homes.
Thank you. Essex County Council.
Good morning. Mark Robinson, Principal Transport and Infrastructure Planner at Essex County Council, representing them as the Highway Authority.
Thank you very much. Estates and Agencies Strategic Land, or EA as I end up calling them.
Good morning, madam. So do I. Good morning, Charlie Banner QC for EA Strategic Land.
Thank you. Hallam Land Management, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. Tom Hill, Queen's Counsel for Hallam Land, and I'm supported today by Mr. Gary Stevens of Marron's Planning on planning matters and Mr. Ron Henry of Stantec on highways and transportation matters.
Thank you. Representative for Mr. Nichols and Mr. Biglin, please.
Good morning, Rachel Bryan from Saunders on behalf of Mr. Nichols and Mr. Biglin.
Thank you very much. Representative for Priest's Lane Neighbourhood Association.
Hello, yes, I'm Kate Webster, representing the Residents Association.
Thank you very much. St Modwen and S&J Padfield, please, the representative for those.
Good morning, ma'am. Yes, Sam Hollingworth from Stratton Parker, representing St Modwen Developments Limited and S&J Padfield and Partners. His particular interest is the Brentwood Enterprise Park. I am joined again by my colleague James Firth, who's available for the detailed questions about site-specific matters if that's required today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tesco, please, the representative.
Good morning, Inspectors. Good morning, Inspector. Selwyn Atkinson, Geo Hearn, on behalf of Tesco.
Thank you very much. And Thurrock Borough Council, please.
Good morning, Inspectors. It's Richard Hatter, Strategic Planning Manager, representing Thurrock Borough Council.
Thank you. Representative for Turn to Us, Clearbrook and M. Scott Properties, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Derek Stebbing from Stratton Parker, representing those three representatives, and I will be making contributions across the piece on behalf of all three. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you. And you and I, please.
Morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. Good morning, everybody. Richard Kimbling, Queen's Counsel for you and I, instructed by Chilmark Consulting. Mike Taylor is on the call too.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Excuse me. Right. I haven't got anybody else on my list, and obviously if any technical witnesses or experts need to come in, then obviously they can introduce themselves when they join the event. But obviously I am aware that they are in the meeting, the virtual meeting. Nobody else present. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Now, today we're going to be talking specifically about the spatial strategy. and the questions that we have set under matter 2. Now, this matter is really to focus on the discussion about the overall spatial strategy and how the council came to the decision that it did on the spatial strategy, and whether the strategy in the plan is justified in that context. Now, detailed discussions on site allocations will be discussed later on. I've already reiterated that in my short introduction. Dunton Hills Garden Village will mainly be discussed under matter 6, but quite rightly it will be discussed today as part of the spatial strategy, and I'm sure it will be discussed on other sessions as well, because inevitably there is crossover between sessions. However, please try and keep detailed site allocation matters won't be discussed today for specific sites. It is more about the actual spatial strategy in its totality that we will be trying to focus on. So if you can keep that in mind, that we would very much appreciate that. Now, in relation to starting off with our initial questions, we did put some questions in relation to the vision names and the principles and the strategic objectives. Now, we don't have any further questions on the vision, but we do have some questions in relation to the strategic objectives. Is there anybody here who wants to raise any issue? I don't think there is, but I'm just going to check. Is there anybody who wants to raise any issues in relation to the vision before I move on? I didn't think there was, but I just thought I would clarify. No. Okay, thank you. So if we just bring up the strategic objectives. A couple of questions have been raised about this in representations, because we have a couple of questions ourselves on this. So first of all, sort of directing our questions to the council in the first instance. We note that you have proposed a change to strategic objective 4, and that's set out in F9A. Now, your reasoning behind that is that you, in your statement, state that this provides greater clarity and ensures that it's in accordance with paragraph 174B of the framework. Can I just clarify with the council that that is correct? That that's the reasoning behind why you feel that objective 4 needs an amendment, just so that we're absolutely clear. And then I would just want to ask participants whether they've got any questions in relation to that proposed amendment. So can I ask the council to come forward, please? Is it Mr. Shadorevian, please?
I think it's me, Inspector.
Oh,
thank you.
Mr. Dre.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's correct. In terms of the reasoning, that is as a result of ongoing engagement with Essex County Council and discussions about the need to clarify that point in line with the framework.
It's about, yes, it's about bringing in the net gain element in relation to biodiversity, isn't it? Just on that particular point, I know it's becoming quite detailed quite quickly, but it's just, if we can get some of these detailed points out the way, we will then move on further on to the more strategic elements. I just want to ensure that I understand what the proposals are in relation to the objectives and what changes are coming forward. So does anybody have any particular comments on that proposed change? Don't think anybody has raised it. Because obviously it has been available for a while, because this was the F9A document was in response to our initial questions, so it has been available for people to comment on. Okay, thank you. I don't necessarily have any issues about that. I think it does provide greater effectiveness for the strategic objective if it actually clarifies and makes reference to the net gain element. And I think that does ensure that it's in accordance with the framework. So in relation to that, then I don't have any issues with the proposed change that's put forward on there. Now, on just moving forward off that, another proposed change has been put forward by a representative, and I think it's is it Mr. Butler from Constable Homes? Have I got that right? I think you've put in your statement about wanting a further strategic objective added about the rural communities. Is that correct?
That's not my recollection, Inspector. I don't think.
I may have, well, my apologies then if it's the wrong representation. I do apologise. There is a representation, exactly whom it is. It could be, it might be somebody who's not here. My apologies. Could be somebody who is now not attending today, because we have had some withdrawals this morning. Okay, so if I can just clarify this then with the council, the point that's been raised is that a request for an additional strategic objective has been put forward in relation to ensuring the vitality of the borough's thriving rural communities. So I don't know if the council has had a chance to have a look at that representation and whether they feel that the strategic objectives already include that, or whether an additional objective is required in relation to thriving rural communities, or whether you feel that's already included in your strategic objectives. Is that Mr. Drain?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I think overall, in terms of what we're trying to achieve in urban areas, and this being the point really that we'll come back to today on spatial strategy, that the vast majority of our villages in terms of rural areas will be within urban areas outside of the green belt, and then we don't have that issue of the green belt washing over, but predominantly through the management of sustainable growth, resilient built environment and other strategic objectives. I think we feel that that is sufficiently covered to both apply to urban areas in terms of the centre of the borough as well as more rural locations. There are elements within the economic section, as we think about the economy in particular, that looks at the rural economy in particular being a different type of need and therefore having a different policy approach. But we would feel in terms of the strategic objectives and policy SPO1 covers that.
Well, we'll be coming on to policy SPO1 later. So we've got further queries on that point, but what you're saying is it's already covered in the strategic objectives and within the policies themselves. Is that correct? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. That's just provided a bit of clarity on that. Thank you. I suppose one question that I have is that you have SO4 is specifically a requirement or a strategic objective on the natural environment. And I know that SO2 is a strategic objective relating to the built environment, but there isn't specific wording in relation to the historic environment. I know that that is obviously within the policies, and you have heritage policies. But is that something that the council feels may be missing? Is it something that you feel is already within the strategic objectives, or is it something that is missing and could require further clarity? I'd just like your take on that point, Mr. Drain.
Thank you, Inspector. I think, again, we would view that as being covered by the built environment more generally. So appreciating that the historic environment is a specific issue. There will be a number of specific issues that are covered within the built and natural environment. So I think we're trying to keep it as simple as possible, I suppose. So we think it's covered.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. We're going to be just having a look at that to just see whether it does need a little bit more clarity, but I'm not going to tell you now to go away and have a look at that. That's something we will give direction on later if necessary. So thank you for that. Can we now move on to the settlement hierarchy and our questions in relation to that on our MIQs? Now, first of all, before we look at the detail of the settlement hierarchy and how it's been determined, we would like to query the council on the effectiveness of its positioning within the plan, its purpose of where it is and how it is read within the context of somebody coming forward and either proposing development or a decision maker looking at the settlement hierarchy. Now, it's within chapter 2, which seems to be a context policy. It's just setting out this is what is. So from our perspective, we're trying to understand what the purpose of the settlement hierarchy is within that chapter and within the plan as a whole, which is why we've raised our questions about why is it not set out in policy? What's its purpose? Is it trying to, how will it control development or manage development? How will a decision maker or potential developers or residents view that settlement hierarchy? So, and also we also note that I think it's in paragraph 7.48, reference is made in the plan to the settlement hierarchy being in SPO2. So let me just double check that to make sure I'm correct on that. So it seems to me that there has been some moving around of this over the different variations of the plan. Yes, it sets it out there. It says it's set out in policy SPO2, managing growth. So can the council just first of all just clarify, obviously something has happened and the settlement hierarchy has moved out of that policy in some previous versions of the plan, and why the settlement hierarchy is set out as it is in a context chapter, which and what's its purpose? Is that Mr. Drain or Mr. Shadow-Edvian?
Thank you, Inspector. I think we tried to explain the contextual situation with regard to the positioning of the settlement categories in the plan within our hearing statements. So in that sense, it is really talking about the fact that we're reflecting on the role of the urban areas as they sit outside the Greenbelt and the way in which local facilities services are within them according to those categories. So there should be a bit of clarity on that there. I will just need to have a moment just to check on the situation in terms of how it relates over to SPO2, if you could just bear with me.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
I wonder if I can assist, Mom.
Mr. Shadow-Edvian, yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is a borough which is highly constrained by Greenbelt. Unlike other authorities, it allocates such land as it deems necessary to fulfill the housing requirement and employment requirement, and will do so by deallocating the Greenbelt in those areas. What's left is Greenbelt. We don't have an open countryside to which more generic policies might apply ordinarily. And therefore, the growth which is planned is constrained beyond that by the Greenbelt. So we don't have to concern ourselves with open countryside policies and prospective development in the countryside on that basis. The allocations have been made in accordance with the hierarchy, we say, and reflect the hierarchy appropriately as identified. The proposal is to move the hierarchy into SPO2 under the heading Managing Growth, so that the hierarchy achieves a policy status, if you like. If in the future development management decisions have to consider applications in the Greenbelt on unallocated sites, then the decision maker will have regard to the hierarchy as set out in the policy in terms of assessing the relative sustainability of the particular site within that hierarchy. So that's essentially what is being proposed here.
Okay.
I mean, inevitably, any application that comes forward for a non-allocated site, other than those within the conurbations themselves, would have to satisfy a very stringent test of very special circumstances.
We're fully aware of that.
Of course you are, yes.
Which is obviously why we're trying to understand the settlement hierarchy. Obviously, in relation to the settlement boundary element of that, there is no requirement in national policy to have settlement boundaries. And what you're saying is your settlement boundaries are defined by the Greenbelt.
Yes.
So that's very clear on that particular point. It was just trying to understand, because I don't think it's absolutely clear within the plan what the role of these settlement categories were, taking into account what you've just said about the Greenbelt and the restrictions that apply there and the very stringent nature of development in the Greenbelt. So your statement didn't absolutely say that you would be putting it into policy SPO2. It said you were open to that suggestion.
Yes, and that remains the case. Mum, if you feel that for the effectiveness of the plan as a whole, in terms of managing future applications for development proposals outside the allocated sites and the existing conurbations, the settlement hierarchy can be brought into SPO2, and I think it's a sensible place to have it.
I think it is something that we would like you to have a look at and consider. We won't absolutely give direction on any main modifications until the end of the hearing sessions. We will have some final time and days actually looking at all of the potential main modifications at that point, and then we'll give final clarity on that.
Yes, I understand the implication of what you're saying, because we would need actually to include words there which explain its presence within the policy.
Absolutely. So it could be that it's whether it's relevant that it sits within that policy, whether it sits within a different policy, or whether actually where it sits at the moment is absolutely fine. We just have some concerns as to because I think the issue is necessarily it's almost within a contextual chapter rather than an actual policy chapter where you're starting to set out, okay, this is our strategy and this is what we're trying to achieve. So I think it's just trying to provide that clarity as to how anybody uses this, should any decisions come, any proposals come forward, or any decisions are necessary. And obviously I will be looking at whether the settlement categorization is justified in a moment. That's the next element of the conversation. But if you could have a look at that, please, because there are some further changes potentially to SPO2 that may cloud that sort of judgment as to whether it should be an SPO2 or whether it should be a separate policy, etc. Because it's about the SPO2 is about setting out the spatial strategy itself, and whether this addition would cloud that or make it a little bit too onerous to understand. So can I just leave that one with you to just reconsider at this stage?
Of course.
But we will provide further direction.
I'm grateful for that.
I think we need to go through some further discussions on other sessions first before we come back to that.
Very good.
Thank you. Now, does anybody wish to speak on that point? There were a couple of comments made about the settlement hierarchy, some saying it should be in policy, some saying it shouldn't, but I think we've made that quite clear at the moment that it's something to be looked at but no definitive response at the moment, because it depends on further conversations about exactly what where we go on the spatial strategy element and where that should sit. No queries, right? Thank you. So if I can now look at the placement of the settlements within the settlement hierarchy and how that has been carried out. The council, we did ask this in our initial questions, and you've obviously, the council has directed us to your response that you put in there, and you've added some additional evidence in your hearing statement. You are proposing in your hearing statement some changes to simplify it, but first of all, what I want to focus on is whether the placement of the settlements within that categorisation are justified, and on what basis, what methodology has been used. Now, the council, you clarify that this is based on size and prominence in the borough, the population size, and its location relative to the Brentwood urban area. Has any analysis been done in relation to the accessibility of the, except for distance, because that's what you seem to be implying, it's a location relative to to the Brentwood urban area. It seems to imply the distance from that area, but that may not explain the accessibility in terms, particularly through sustainable transport means and buses, railway, cycling, walking, etc. And whether there has been an assessment of the services and facilities that are available within each settlement, and then whether that categorisation is does that actually make sense and whether it's justified. Has any of that sort of assessment taken place? Because it doesn't seem to have. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's wrong, but I'm just trying to fathom out why settlements are set out in the categories that they are. Is that Mr. Drain again? Or Mr. Shadow?
Thank you, Inspector. I'm just going to pass you over to Kay Polaris, who will be able to answer that question.
Thank you very much.
So, as we explained in our statement, it was a sort of a high-level analysis of the settlements, and we did take into account its size in terms of its area and its population to sort of judge its location in the settlement hierarchy. In terms of your question around accessibility, again, it was a broad brush sort of analysis in terms of distance to key railway connections, and of course road connections. It wasn't an in-depth analysis of going down to the meticulous detail of bus routes or cycle routes or anything like that. But broadly, the hierarchy does set out that it does reflect the fact that the more distant rural villages are quite far away from any connections. They may have some bus services, but in terms of the overall sort of accessibility, that's kind of reflected in the settlement hierarchy. The hierarchy also reflects broadly the ONS sort of rural classification hierarchy, so it's broadly consistent with that. And again, looking at the services that were also available within the settlements was also something that was considered when placing it in the hierarchy. So whether they had local centres or district centres, etc. The main settlement category 1 was really just looking at it as the main Brentwood area. We didn't necessarily go in to have a look at Hutton separately or Pilgrim's Hatch separately. It was really considering the main urban area sort of as one area, as one mass, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anybody have any queries in relation to the placement of settlements within the categorisation? Mr. Stebbing, please. Oh, your microphone is on mute, Mr. Stebbing.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we do have concerns over the placement of a number of settlements within that hierarchy. And you will have seen from our hearing statements, I have specific issues over Mount Nessing, Ingrave and Herongate. And I'll talk broadly across that because all three of those settlements do have good bus services. They're proximate to the Brentwood urban area, and yet that accessibility is not recognised at all, and K Polaris has effectively just confirmed that. Mount Nessing, for example, has a half-hourly bus service to Chelmsford and to central Brentwood. Very good access to the A12 and good access to Shenfield railway station. Now, in terms of sustainability, I view that as a considerably higher order settlement than many of the more rural villages in Brentwood. And I think the plan should recognise that. And what's effectively at play here is a policy that will fossilise a number of villages where there are options for a limited amount of growth and with facilities on their doorstep, in fact, that will sustain that community. And that's my main issue here with the sort of settlements I've just described to you.
Thank you, Mr. Stebbing. There are some other hands up. So if I can come to Ms. Adams, please.
Thank you. On a similar vein to Mr. Stebbing, I just wanted to sort of quiz this point about the lack of evidence perhaps on some of the rural villages in the rural north and looking at those services that are within those settlements, and specifically looking at the aim and the vision around the local plan in terms of ensuring villages remain as thriving communities, and yet those services and the sustainability of some of those settlements doesn't appear to have been reviewed in depth, and how those settlements function. Doddinghurst, potentially, I think there's quite a lot of discussion about Doddinghurst and Hook North and Wyatt's Green, and how those settlements relate and how they function. Do they function as one settlement? Do they share services? And that sort of investigation hasn't, in my opinion, perhaps been explored yet, and perhaps that's something the council would wish to look at.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan, Ms. Bryan, please.
Hello, thank you. I also want to agree with what Mr. Stebbing said. We have particular concerns about the stagnation of rural villages, particularly Ingrave and Herongate, which we consider really should have been treated as a single settlement rather than separated. They function very much as one village. And just to add that I noted that Ms. Polaris mentioned population was considered as a factor in the assessment. And if you add together the population of Ingrave and Herongate, then their combined population is actually bigger than West Horndon, which is a category 2 as opposed to a category 3.
Thank you. Can I come back to the council to respond on those points, please? Mr. Drain.
Thank you, Inspector. I think we just, apologies, hang on. Thank you. We need to come back to what we're saying about what the point of the assessment categories are, which is to set out the situation in regard to location, services, facilities, distances. There's a number of things that factor in here. So not just about bus services, and would certainly want to sort of look at the way in which we've tried to separate out, for instance, Ingatestone and West Horndon as villages that have stations and therefore direct access to train services, in comparison to, say, the example there being said, if you join together Ingrave and Herongate, it has a similar population number to West Horndon. The point is not here is to sort of separate out according to what has similar population numbers. It is to think about the level of services and facilities and other aspects of sort of more sustainable measures of how you connect to these places, and to set them out in that way. So again, I think, as Kay said, we haven't delved into extreme detail on this, but it is our awareness and our knowledge of those local services, of the size of those places and the way in which they interrelate. The fact that we have Greenbelt in that separates out places like Hook End and Wyatt's Green and Stondon Massey means that whilst I agree with the point that they function in a way in terms of their use of local services, sometimes in ways where they share facilities, they are individual settlements because the Greenbelt defines them as such, and therefore that is how we've tried to reflect that. So there's some nuance here in terms of just looking at the way in which the Greenbelt is drawn around these settlements and the way in which they have local services and facilities, and that's what we're trying to reflect here in the assessment categories.
I suppose as for ourselves as inspectors coming in to consider the plan, we see there is a lack of evidence justifying why the settlements are set out. We don't have your knowledge, because it's not set out anywhere, as to why individual settlements are set out where they are. Now, I'm not necessarily going to advocate that you go ahead and do, a huge study on settlement hierarchy in relation to where settlements should be located, but it would be useful to have a note of some kind or evidence of some kind to specify, well, what facilities has this village or this settlement got, because we don't know, so we can't actually clarify whether this actually makes sense. Now, obviously, I have actually been and had a look at these villages myself. We have actually gone around and done site visits, so I have an element of knowledge from myself looking at sites and going to those settlements. Now, I'm not, again, and I don't want this to be considered that this is a huge study that I'm asking for you to do, but I think it would be very helpful if you could just clarify, are there bus services? How often are they? I don't think, I'm not saying you need to put down which bus services by which provider at what times and all of that information, but I think it would be useful for us to understand the accessibility and the facilities and the services that are provided within these settlements. Now, having said that, we are trying to understand, obviously, because of the Brentwood being different in terms of these settlements are surrounded by Greenbelt. All of your settlements are surrounded by Greenbelt. We just want to understand the purpose and role of each settlement within your strategy and whether it's justified. Because we have representations from other participants who are saying, well, but this settlement has bus services, so it's really highly accessible. So why is there no development happening here? So, or why is that a category, whatever it is within the settlement hierarchy? So I think we just need that a little bit more evidence to just understand why the settlement hierarchy is as it is, and how, because it's important how that is then fed into the spatial strategy. That's why I'm putting a bit of emphasis on the settlement hierarchy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Inspector. That's fine. There is work that we have done to begin to start thinking that through. So that should be fine for us to pull that together to give more clarity on the situation. I would just emphasise the difference between, again, what we're trying to do here to talk about the existing nature of these settlements, and that's separate from their development potential in terms of sites, which I know we'll come on to, and whether appropriate sites are in those areas. So the settlement categories do not necessarily, that is not the only thing that defines the way in which development may come forward in the future. But in terms of a note, that's fine.
Thank you. Do you know how quickly you could get that to us? Is it going to take days, weeks?
I suspect days, but just bear with me.
Okay, thank you. I can leave that one with you if you wish, and if you can come back to us after, maybe at the break or something, and just give an indication. I don't want you to, I know you're in the middle of doing this, so it's how much work you can get done at the moment.
Sure. I suspect we could do it by next week, but we'll check and confirm that with you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. And again, it's to reiterate what we're trying to understand is the role of these settlements in your spatial strategy. What is the role? What are you trying to achieve for these settlements? So that's why we're focusing on the settlement hierarchy at the moment. Are there any, Mr. Stebbing, you still got your hand up. Is that an additional question?
It's, yes, it is, madam. I very much welcome your request for the enhanced information that you've just sought from Mr. Drain. I'm sure you've recognised that the point I'm driving at, that within the borough of villages, as Mr. Shadarivian would remind me, there are villages that I believe perform a wider role and a wider function than others. And I hope the information you're requesting helps you understand that.
Thank you, Mr. Stebbing. I understand what you're saying, so thank you. Thank you for that. Anything further on that particular point? No. Now, obviously, we've got the South Essex Strategic Growth Locations Study, which we haven't had a chance to have a look at yet. I know it's now available on the website. That's my understanding. That's gone on there now, which does look at now. That's not necessarily looking at. That's looking at development sustainable locations in relation to potential development as part of the JSP work that's ongoing. But obviously, we'll need to have a look at that in relation to how that, or whether that has any implications on this strategy at all, and the way that the settlement hierarchy is set out here. Can I just have the council's just general approach on that in relation to, do you feel that that has any implications, or do you feel that because that's for the JSP, not for this plan, but that evidence is before us now because it's been put before us, we do need to consider it? So, council's response on that, does that need to be taken into account?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. Our view is that it is for the JSP process, and that is the purpose of the work. So whilst it does not inform the Brentwood local plan in the sense that the Brentwood local plan went before it, at the same time, what it is trying to do is to consider from a policy off perspective where sustainable locations to grow might be, and therefore I would suggest that the outputs from that work would be consistent with what we've looked at in terms of broad areas to consider for growth, the extent to which we would consider all sites that have come forward within those areas, and then tested them through the work that we've done in the sustainability appraisal and other pieces of site assessment work. So we would not consider it to be something that we've looked at to inform the Brentwood local plan because it's come after the Brentwood local plan. But in terms of what it is trying to do, I think it would be consistent with what we've been looking at in terms of where sustainable locations might be to consider would be appropriate to grow.
Thank you. Obviously, I don't really want to go into detail on that because we as inspectors haven't had a chance to read that document as yet and actually look at it in detail. So, because it's only gone on the website today, so we will have a look at that when we get the opportunity and may have some further questions on that. But obviously, we recognise that that evidence, that document wasn't available. Whether the evidence backing behind it was available, because I'm not quite sure when it was actually prepared. Then we may have further questions on that later. Now, I have a number of hands that have gone up, so I'm going to go down the list that I've got, starting with Mr. Banner, please.
Thank you, Madam. Without commenting on the content of that document yet, it would be very, very helpful to all concerned to have complete clarity from the council as to whether thus far they have or have not taken into account its contents as a material consideration in the preparation of this plan and promotion of this plan at this EIP. There are legal connotations as to whether they have or haven't, And I think it's absolutely necessary for you to have complete clarity from the council as to whether they have or haven't so far.
I'll ask the council to respond on that point. Having not, I was trying not to get to sort of say you must take this into account because I haven't read it yet. I will be open on that point because I haven't had the opportunity. What I'm trying to understand is the document has been published today, and I know that was earlier than anticipated. And you're saying, well, it's been published after the plan, but when was work carried out on it and how was that taken into account? I think that's the point that Mr. Banner is making. Work obviously has been going on this. Was that work carried out prior to the submission of the plan, and was it taken on board as part of the submission of this plan?
Thank you, Inspector.
That's Drain.
Yes, the answer is that in terms of the completed works as are now published, they have not been taken into account in terms of the Brentwood local plan process because they were completed post submission in terms of when that document has been finalised and post preparation of the Regulation 19 work. But in terms of the evidence and your point there about the wider evidence that informs it and the work that is going on with that, then that, as I think my point was, would be consistent with the evidence that we have been looking at in terms of thinking about sustainable locations within our borough and the wider South Essex in terms of how it relates to us outside of our borough. Will be consistent. So we have had an awareness of the work whilst we've been producing the Brentwood local plan, but the completed product of that, as is published, has not formally informed our work.
Thank you. That has provided some clarity on that point. Mr. Banner, I will bring you back in on that.
Yes, I do need to come back on that because it's when an answer is very carefully worded like that, it does require a degree of careful scrutiny, because whilst the report has been, as Mr. Drain called it, finalised after the plan, does rather beg the question, given the chronology, what about earlier drafts, the evidence base? And let me be very clear about the legal connotations both ways. If, and we haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but if it contains relevant material relevant to the decisions undertaken in relation to this plan, if it wasn't taken into account, that may, I don't go any further than that yet, may generate a failure to take into account material considerations, which may have legal implications. And if it was taken into account, but any of what was taken into account, whether it was an earlier draft or evidence based on this, etc., was omitted from the sustainability appraisal, then there may be an SEA point because the council would have taken into account environmental information that wasn't subject to SEA. So whichever way it worked, there are potential consequences. I'm not talking about challenge yet, but there are consequences for you and your fellow inspector as well in terms of how it's approached. So I suggest it's not good enough to say it wasn't finalised, because if it was sitting on a shelf unfinalised for a long period of time, or if there were earlier drafts, that does beg the question, were they had regard to, were they not? Because what flows in law from whether or not they were had regard to is different. And it's only right as a matter of fairness that the participants of this inquiry understand what happened with complete clarity so that we have an opportunity to consider those legal consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Banner.
Can I respond to that, please?
Mr. Shadow.
Before we get into legal principles and whether or not there's a challengeable decision being made at the end of the day, let's have a look at the document and see what it says. And have regard to process as well. What this document is trying to achieve, its status, and then consider whether there's anything in that which ought to be drawn to your attention in terms of your analysis of the evidence base which informs this plan and its policies. So let's look at it from a practical point of view at this point in time to assess its relevance, first of all, and what flows from it.
Thank you, Mr. Shadorevian. Mr. Banner, I will move on from this point. Yeah. What I want to just say is that we all need to read this document first. And what I will say is that if necessary, and we need to have a session to discuss the implications, if necessary, then that can be arranged later on.
Thank you, Madam. I do understand that, and I'm very, very grateful. But with respect, Mr. Shedder-Even's answer doesn't bear scrutiny, because we need to understand the significance of what we're reading. And we need to understand the contents of what we're reading. He and his clients do, because it's partly their document, and they understand what's been going on behind the scenes prior to its publication. We don't, and that's the disadvantage that we're at. Thank you, Mr. Banner. So can I bring in other participants who have had their hands up? So I will go now to Mr. Hill, please.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I can be quite short about this. We have, like everyone else, only had a brief opportunity to review the contents of the study, which, as you would have seen, bears the date May 2020, but obviously has only entered the public domain in December. Our initial review of it suggests that there are matters in there that you ought to have regard to, and we would like an indication from you when you and your colleague have had an opportunity to review it briefly as to whether you would accept further representations from the parties to the examination on the content of the document, focused in particular on any inconsistencies that arise from the document when compared with the strategy set out in the plan.
Thank you. We will certainly give, we need to obviously consider that. I need to discuss that with my colleague, and we will give an indication as to when we will have the opportunity to read that evidence and when we will be allowing comments on it. So thank you, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Fennell, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I have a very short point to make too. In case it's helpful to you, I point you to section 1.5 of the growth location study, where the consultants advise on their view of the relationship between existing and emerging development plans in South Essex. So I won't repeat that, but I'll just point you to that in case it helps in your consideration of that report.
Thank you. Mr. Hatter, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. Really, just to confirm with Mr. Drain's point that a lot of the evidence in this study was available quite a while before the actual final version of the document was produced. And that really kind of follows on from our hearing statements and representations, that we think there are areas that should have been assessed during the plan process, particularly along the A12 corridor, that haven't actually been covered by the current plan and SA process. So I think it is an issue that I agree that the evidence was available, even if the finalised report of all the relevant sections has only just been put together in the late spring.
Thank you. Mr. Drain, do you want to come back on any of those, or Mr. Shadaravian, anything further you want to say at this point on that?
No, Ma'am. Let's let the parties have a look at this. Yeah, you need time to look at it, and in particular, the caveats expressed in here as well with respect to the evidence base for the emerging plans. I'll leave it at that for the time being.
Thank you. Thank you on that particular point. We will give an indication as soon as we possibly can in relation to when, as I said, when we will allow comments on that. But again, we probably, ourselves as inspectors, probably won't have the opportunity to read that section in any detail until next week, to be fair. And then we may then have further questions. We may not until we've read it. We're not sure. So so next week we will give an indication as to when a deadline to be given for comments on that particular document and any further documents that come out of this week's discussions. So, thank you. Now, just before we move off the settlement hierarchy, I just want to understand the Council's proposed changes that you've set out in response to our questions. They're set out in your hearing statement. And again, it's probably something that you can look at as, because I've asked you to have a look at whether it should be in SPO2, whether it shouldn't, whether it should be in its own policy, whether it sitting where it is okay. You are proposing some potential wording changes where you're taking out the elements about development. So you're very much changing the focus of what the settlement hierarchy is trying to achieve there. So can I just understand that explanation? Because you're taking out the development opportunities should you're taking out the elements of where development should be focused. Is that because the plan itself is already setting that out in its own policies in relation to allocations? There can't be further development in those locations unless very special circumstances can be achieved, and therefore having that wording within that settlement hierarchy as it currently is doesn't really give clarity on that point, particularly in relation to greenbelt development or development in the greenbelt. Am I getting the right understanding that that's why you want to take these elements out and amend this?
Yes, ma'am. The function of the hierarchy should be descriptive. It's passive in that sense because it provides you with the parameters. The elements there which deal with action actually should be dealt with in the relevant policies and is dealt with in the relevant policies and doesn't need to be in the description of these settlement categories.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarity on there. Any queries or questions on that from any other participants? No. Oh, Ms. Bryan, please.
Thank you. I was quite concerned when I saw this change. I just to check, we're talking about the removal of the brownfield development element of that. And the council statement says it's just to clarify and simplify the table, but that seems to be much more of a significant change. And certainly in the category 3 settlements, it would deny them of any development at all by removing that allowance.
Council response? Mr. Shadoravian?
I can't say any more than I've said already. And as you rightly indicated, further development other than in relation to brownfield sites would need to meet stringent tests. And it's not for a policy to say that development of some type would be encouraged in the green belt without making a specific allocation in the green belt.
Well, I've already tasked you to just have a look at this in relation to where it should sit or whether it should sit within a policy. So obviously we will see what you propose.
Yeah, what I would suggest is, I mean, there might be something in the comment about the brownfield element of that, and we need to make sure that insofar as we need a positive approach to brownfield development that is appropriately communicated through the policies. So I'll certainly have a look at that.
Within the settlements, because obviously brownfield outside the settlements is still within the greenbelt.
Brownfield within settlements,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, if you can do that, that would be really useful. That would
I will indeed, yes.
Some clarity. Thank you. Okay. Right. Thank you for that. Anything further on the settlement hierarchy? I know we've spent a little bit of time on that, but I think it's quite a critical part of understanding the spatial strategy and where the spatial strategy is going. Set out within the plan. Nothing further, right? Okay. What I'd like to do now is move on to considering the actual spatial strategy itself. And I would first of all, again, I just want to get some of the more of the nitty-gritty elements out of the way first before we move on to actually is the spatial strategy sound in its own right. And again, it's this whether the spatial strategy is adequately set out within the plan itself And we have come to that, we have discussed that previously, and it was referenced in our initial questions in relation to whether there is a requirement for the strategy to be set out in a policy. Now, I understand that changes are proposed to SPO2. Exactly what is necessary for soundness, we will come to those as we move through the progression of the hearing. And the council is now proposing to look at whether the settlement hierarchy needs to go in there. But what I wanted to just clarify, and I think what gives clarity and what I've seen previously with spatial strategies is that the spatial strategy is very clear by setting out in a policy what the distribution of the development is proposed to be. So it's not necessarily about the housing numbers. It can be housing numbers, and they're usually a generalized figure rather than very specific. So, you know, around 100 houses here, or it can be a proportion if you want to go down to, so it's understanding what the strategy is. So this is, and I know that the council has responded back on this and said, well, it's set out in our other policies. But I think an overarching spatial strategy that sets out the distribution of development proposed, so what the spatial strategy is going to be delivering, also highlights then where protection is going to occur. And because then it becomes very clear that 10% of development is going to go here, 20% is going to go there. And it provides that overarching, very quick clarity within the plan. So I know the council, you're looking at SPO2 in relation to bringing in further elements of growth, and I know you're proposing or potentially proposing to change that. We've put forward a suggestion to change the title of that policy to make it clearer that this is the spatial strategy. I would like you to have a look at that in a little bit more detail to just make it clear that, so it's not necessarily changing your strategy at all, it's just setting it out in to make it very clear and to ensure that the policy is effective. So anything from the council on that point, Mr. Shadaravian?
I understand the point you're making entirely, and I will look at it on that basis.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think it's the clarity. So I'm just rereading my notes. I think it's the clarity on, you've got this, you set out about your transit orientated strategy. You've got central growth and then you've got southern growth, but that isn't clear within a policy. I think that's what I'm getting at. Okay, so it's about, if you can just clarify that, that would be good. Thank you.
Will do.
Thank you. Mr. Stebbing, please.
Thank you, ma'am. If following our earlier discussions and your request for information on the settlement hierarchy, you conclude that other settlements have a place in the spatial strategy or the distribution of growth strategy, if I can put it that way, will you reopen the conversation about how that has implications for policy SPO2?
I think we haven't at this stage, we're not proposing to shut down any conversations at this stage. I think there is new information coming in that we haven't had a chance to have a look at. We need to look at that first to see whether it does have any connotations for this plan in particular. And we will certainly take on board comments made about, well, actually, this should be looked at in more detail. We may need to have another hearing session or through written representations, need to ask some further questions, etc. on this point. So whether we'll come on to have a look at the spatial strategy now in a bit more detail. The impact of the document that you're referring to, and whether development should occur somewhere else.
I'll just leave that query in
just
your
leave
mind.
that with us, because then you're starting to head into the territory of emission sites, and that's not what's before us, but it's about the evidence. So leave that with us.
It is about the evidence. You're quite correct, Mum. And I think the evidence is rather weak.
Thank you, Mr. Stebbing. Ms. Piper, please.
Yes, Ma'am. If it helps, in our representations at paragraph 2.7 on this matter, we did actually propose a change to the supporting text for SPO2 just to set out the council's actual strategy and putting it together into a few bullet points to actually set the scene for the policy that you are suggesting SPO2 should be.
Thank you, Ms. Piper. No, that's a good reminder. When we talk about policies, we're not just talking about policy wording, because the policies need to be justified. So when we say, can you have a look at that policy, we're actually asking the council as well, but maybe I need to clarify this, to also look at the justification text. Because if you start changing the policy itself, the justification text needs to then justify the policy. So it could be that that needs to be looked at anyway. So we were, by asking the council to be looking at the SPO2 and the changes there, we are basically saying, well, you need to look at the justification text as well to just see if there are any connotations from the changes. There's always consequences to changes, and it could be there's consequences to changes elsewhere in the plan as well. So the council will need to look at those as well. But thank you for that reminder. Thank you. So if the council can have a look at any recommendations that are, or not recommendations, sort of suggestions that are made in any of the representations that have been made as part of that, that would be really useful as well. So thank you. Okay. If we can start now to, nobody else wants to have a word? No, no other hands up. Good, thank you. Okay, so all that's about is the positioning of the strategy and whether the strategy is clear within the policy. Now, what I want to move on to is our question 21, where we start to look at the soundness of the spatial strategy itself. And we've got a number of aspects within that policy where we ask the queries about whether the strategy actually does focus significant development in locations which are or can be made sustainable in accordance with paragraph 103 of the framework. So one of our questions is obviously, is this adequately demonstrated in the evidence? But on top of that, also, we are obviously mindful of paragraph 138 of the framework, which is in relation to the release of greenbelt land, and where it has been concluded that it's necessary to release greenbelt land, and the council has said that it is necessary. And we will obviously be looking at greenbelt. That's another factor that we'll be looking at on Friday. Plans should give first consideration to land which has been previously developed and or is well served by public transport. So it's those elements of the strategy that we now want to have a look at. Now, the council's set out its has set out its response to our MOQs on that. I'm not necessarily going to go into going to ask the council to repeat all of that at all. Don't think that's necessary. What I would like to do is bring in some of the participants who have raised issues with the strategy, and what I would like to focus on first is that from what I'm looking at, from what we're looking at ourselves, and having considered the representations that we've read, the vast majority, I'm not saying all, but the vast majority of representations are aren't necessarily against the strategy of putting most development, not saying necessarily all, but most development along the two transit corridors. That's not necessarily a huge issue in terms of a strategy, and quite a number of participants around the table actually support that overall approach to focusing development in those locations. The specific detail related to that and exactly where that development goes, that's where the issues have arisen, or where representations have been made. So it's about the balance and the distribution of growth that having read the evidence, that we feel that seems to be a bit of a sticking point for some participants around the table in relation to the evidence that's available. So what I would like to do is just open up the floor to a certain extent to try and just summarise some of the key points so that I can then get a response from the council rather than going through the council's every single point. So can I start with Mr. Banner, please?
Thank you, Madam. If I may say so, I think what you just said was a very fair and proper characterisation of the controversial issues. There's a lot of detail on this in our representations and hearing statement. I don't propose also to go into that. The critical points as we see it, and this is again another area where all the real central issues before you are sort of interlinked and intertwined. But the critical issue, as we see it, is that West Horndon, with its existing rail infrastructure, is the most sustainable location for growth within the southern corridor. And we set out in our hearing statement, as you would have seen, I do ask you, even if you've read them and reread them already, to go back and have at least one further look. I think they're rightly called isochrones, figures 1 and figures 2, the walking plans of West Horndon compared to Dunton, and then figures 3 and figures 4, which crucially are and very revealingly, the comparative public transport network plans, which show the extent to which locations can be covered in 60 minutes by public transport from West Horndon compared to Dunton. I don't understand that the accuracy of what is shown in these figures is it disputed, and it's quite profound, the extent of the difference in the range of accessibility by public transport. Put simply, West Horndon has a much greater coverage by public transport within 60 minutes, as well as more localised access to facilities by sustainable transport means. While in the context of Greenbelt, of course, paragraph 138, which you referenced, doesn't use language are or can be made sustainable. That's the sort of general provision, but the specific provision related to Greenbelt release is looking at prioritising or giving first consideration to land which is well served by public transport. West Horndon is, Dunton isn't, and so therefore that sequential approach, if I can use that shorthand in 135, plainly favours a different strategy within the Southern Corridor to that proposed. There's a further point where I should also add, Madam, that even with the additional infrastructure on which Dunton is reliant, it still will perform worse because it's further away from the rail infrastructure. Even if all of that isn't enough to favour our analysis in relation to the inadequacies of the spatial strategy. What it shows, Madam, is there is considerably greater risk and uncertainty in relation to Dunton because of its reliance on new infrastructure to make it supposedly sustainable. And that is a risk both in terms of viability, which obviously we'll look at later, but it's also a risk in relation to timing and delivery, and both delivery of Dunton and with it delivery of the plan. And that ties in with issues which have been discussed and will be discussed in different respects in relation to the extent of the plan's reliance on Dunton and the lack of a sufficient buffer to allow for that risk materialising, the chips on black I talked about yesterday, that allows that risk materialising, because if there is delay or worse as a result of that reliance on expensive infrastructure to make this location sustainable sufficiently early on that the habits are ingrained and people don't just get used to driving in their car, then if there is a delay to that infrastructure, there'll be a delay to the housing on which this plan is reliant. And so at least what it demonstrates is there ought to be a considerably greater uplift to provide an insurance policy and, if you like, or to make the plan resilient, which it currently isn't. See that housing trajectory we discussed briefly yesterday, and obviously we'll turn to tomorrow. This is not a resilient plan, and if you're against us on duty to cooperate, so there isn't a knockout point, it's within your and your fellow inspectors' power to help make it a resilient plan, and providing that uplift would achieve that. There's an associated point, Madam, which is explored. There's a lot of detail here, so I prefer just to give you the reference, but it's paragraph 2.14 and 2.15 of our hearing statement on this matter, G2K, where we set out that if there was an uplift which had the consequence of West Horndon going in addition to Dunton, as opposed to being an alternative, as well as providing that resilience in relation to the numbers because of the more oven ready nature of our site and our location, it would actually help make Dunton more achievable and less risky because of the ability to provide infrastructure improvements at West Horndon that would benefit and help make more sustainable more quickly Dunton. Those infrastructure improvements include improvements to the station at West Horndon and provision of a link road which would be able to link Dunton to the station without going through the existing village, which has all sorts of benefits. So what in this situation you'd be able to do would be to make the plan more resilient, but also reduce the risk associated with Dunton. That probably is sufficient for me to answer both your question A, question C, and I think probably question G, because they're all, as I say, they're different sides of the same coin, really. So if you can take that answer as an answer to those sub questions, it may reduce or avoid my need to speak again on those sub issues.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Banner. All right. Can I bring in Mr. Hill, please?
Thank you, ma'am. And I fully understand the point you made at the outset that there are a large number of linkages across to other issues that you're considering during this examination. I'm going to try and confine myself to your question 21 points, which are really concerned with the balance of the plan, the balance of the spatial strategy and how that has been achieved. I think the first thing I'd like to do, ma'am, is just to draw attention to what we consider to be a very misleading summary of the balance at paragraph 41 of the Council's hearing statement for this session. And if you look at that paragraph, the Council assert that
I've got that in front of me. Yep.
That the distribution of allocation sites reflects a sustainable pattern of growth. 70%, they proclaim, of the allocation sites are located along the central growth corridor, the main urban area. And then 17% of the site allocations are located in the south growth corridor. Of course, that is entirely misleading because it's simply a totting up of the numbers of sites. What is, of course, important is the capacity of those sites and where the numbers lie. And if you just scroll up or look up to the figure that immediately precedes paragraph 41, which I think is labelled figure 21.1, spatial distribution of the site allocations in relation to the growth corridors, you can immediately see that the sites around the central growth corridor are very small in nature, and the major concentration of growth is quite plainly at the Dunton Hills site over in the southeastern corner of that plan. So I think I'm starting by saying take that paragraph very carefully and focus on the numbers, not the numbers of sites. May sound like an obvious point, but it was surprising to see the balance characterised in the terms the Council chose in paragraph 41. That does not give you a fair picture. It's definitely not 70% versus 17.5%. So having made that point to start, ma'am, is the basis for that distinction between the focus on the central corridor and the southern corridor sound? And we say patently not. And once you get to grips, and I'm sure you're already getting to grips with the Brentwood area, you may know it well for all I know already, the contrast between that central corridor and the southern corridor is stark in terms of access to facilities, transport infrastructure, and other key elements of infrastructure that are going to need to support new housing. The rail corridors are treated as virtually comparable. That is so far from the case, ma'am, as I hope you and Mr. Warden will know. The Greater Anglia Main Line and the Elizabeth Line provides vast connectivity across the region, runs from Liverpool Street up to Chelmsford, Colchester, Harwich, Ipswich, Norwich. The C2C line is on a totally different scale and provides a totally different scale of connectivity. The attempt, as it were, to suggest that the A12 and Junction 28 are at capacity and can't be addressed, we reject that. I may touch on what Mr. Henry would like to say about that in a moment, but I know you'll come back to that in more detail at a later stage. And the key reasons apparently articulated for distinguishing the focus on the southern corridor from the focus on which we say should be applied to the central corridor are matters of air quality and biodiversity. I hope we'll get a chance to come back to those at a later stage. We say that those objections simply don't stand up to scrutiny when one looks at the evidence that in fact was or should have been available to the council at the time. If you'll allow me, ma'am, I'd just like Mr. Henry to say something by means of technical support in relation to the A12 Junction 28 versus to the A127 Junction 29 point, and then I'll conclude.
That's fine. If it can be quite short, because I do want to bring in Mr. Kimblin, and then I do want to have a break. So I
totally understand that, ma'am. I've tried to be concise.
Thank you, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning. Just to keep it succinct as you've requested, ma'am. Junction 28 scheme is worth noting in terms of Highways England's intentions for upgrade of that is very well defined, assessed in detail, and it's heading towards examination. So that as a scheme, in terms of its trajectory, it has a level of detail and certainty over delivery and funding in that respect in terms of where Highways England are. And they're doing it, as stated, to facilitate, in doing such, to facilitate and allow growth in the area from development that would be benefiting from the Junction 28 improvements. And with that, by comparison, Junction 28 and the improvements proposed, the actual intended improvements are lesser in scale to Junction 29, which really are a cursory outline sketch at this stage with little detail for 29 in terms of the scheme and progression. So there's an element over when you look at the delivery timelines and a lack of clarity and uncertainty associated with Junction 29, that is not the case for Junction 28, which shows it is operating satisfactorily through the modelling in the design year 2037 with no severe impacts. So that does counter previous claims. And in doing so as well, when you look at some of the indicative funding associated with Junction 29 and then the updated funding, 39.5 million, the previous estimate was 38.5 million for Junction 29. So it shows the level of differential in terms of improvements at each junction, which again would highlight the level of severity on each node. So succinctly, that is a level of detail and the TA that's been done by Highways England that would be of relevance when you consider this point, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hill, anything further on that point, or was it finishing with Mr. Henry's point? Oh, Mr. Hill's gone. Okay. Mr. Kimblin, then, please.
I'm here, ma'am. Sorry, I temporarily lost you.
Clicked the wrong button. They're next to each other. Okay. We've all done
connectivity.
It. Don't worry.
Ma'am, no, I will leave it there. If other matters arise, then I'll ask for a further opportunity to speak. But I'm very conscious of the fact you want to press on and also want to take a well-earned break.
Thank you. Mr. Kimblin, please.
Yes, caffeine comes next. You introduced the session in a number of ways, but one of them was by talking about how we came to a decision. How was the decision made? That's what we're talking about here. And I want to tackle that really via 3 words. Firstly, to deal with strategic, it's actually 4 words, strategic site. It's the first idea, then turn to hierarchy, then turn to distribution. It's been very helpful on hierarchy to have had that discussion, which we've already had. But so far as strategic site is concerned, I want to just refer back to what we haven't really picked up, which you were sort of dreading yesterday, and I'm going to do it now at the essay. To turn to the essay as to
I was going to come to that after a break, but there you go. Bring it in now, Mr. Kimblin.
Because I do draw attention to 2 paragraphs in the essay, 4.1.12 and to 5.3.1, because that makes it very clear that we have in the past been approached.
And this is the main essay that we're talking about.
The main essay, A3, the essay which supports the plan.
Yeah.
And 4.1.2 uses the phrase rule. We focused on strategic sites options as a rule, and it's very frank about it. The essay is very frank. It says this was the case in the past, and one gets the same sense from 4.3.1, which you find on page 19 of the document. Throughout the evolution, the recent evolution of the local plan, there's always been an intention to deliver at least 1 large-scale strategic site. That's what I want to say about strategic site, and your question about how we came to the decision on the spatial strategy. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear that I make no criticism of what is said in those paragraphs. It's just very important to understand what the thinking was. What I do want to go on to do is to think about how that then plays out in respect of hierarchy, my second word. Because if one has had a rule or always had an intention to have a large strategic site, that necessarily has an impact on thinking in respect of other parts of the hierarchy. And in that regard, it's been very helpful during the course of this morning to understand the extent to which the evidence is in place to support the settlement hierarchy. You've asked for further evidence in that regard. And to touch upon the hierarchy so far as that relates to Dunton, which, though it doesn't exist, is a second-tier settlement. And so already we start to see some of the thinking. And that brings us to the question of distribution. And very much the same points which Mr. Hill has made just now, with which I very much agree. One then gets a strong influence on the way in which one is going to distribute as between the corridors. And as you, if I may say so correctly, point out, there is this measure of agreement as to along the corridors, but then a question of distribution. What seems to have been passed over and not fully evidenced and assessed is the question of the degree to which one ought to be focusing on that part of the hierarchy, that part of the district which has the best facilities, particularly in respect of transport, Brentwood. And that distribution question is something which is not evidenced as strongly as it should be that given the very, very strong performance of Brentwood and that corridor, and it's via those three interacting words and topics that one sees that the justification for the distribution that has been arrived at is not there and needs support. And so that's what we say to you in terms of what flows from what our submissions are, is that further and additional development is both supportable and ought to be supported in Brentwood for the reasons which I've explained. That would be consistent, in fact, with what's at 212, supporting text to the policy, to the plan, which has Brentwood having the most scope to develop. That's expressly said within the plan itself. So when one puts together those factors, and relying as I do on what Mr. Hill has to say about that northern corridor, one sees that the proportionality here is not what it should be to make the plan robust. And we'll have more to say in due course about the interaction with strategic site, the strategic site, whichever that may be, and how the plan can be made more robust by playing out the spatial strategy and developing a little bit further with focus north and to Brentwood. And that does get us to caffeine.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kimblin. Now, what I'm proposing, I know, Miss Webster, you have put your hand up. What I would like to do, because I want to give you enough time to have your say, and I don't want everybody gasping for coffee. Would it be okay if, as soon as we come back from our coffee break, I will bring you straight in? Would that be okay, Ms. Webster?
Yeah, I think that's very understandable. Yes.
I want to just give you enough time. I don't want to rush you because we're all desperate for a drink. I'd rather you had enough time to obviously say what you wish to say and comment on this point. And then obviously I will bring in anybody else who wants to have this discussion as well. Okay. Can I then thank you, Ms. Webster, for agreeing to that. I appreciate that. It's almost, well, it's just, it's always an in-between number, isn't it? Can we come back at 22:12, please, and we'll continue the discussion. Thank you. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and hopefully you're suitably refreshed after that break. Now, what I wanted to do was come to Ms. Webster, who is representing the Priest's Lane Neighbourhood Residents Association. I obviously was on and listening in on the conversation that you've just had with Annette, so don't worry, Ms. Webster. It's very much, I just want to hear what participants want to say. There are some specific questions that I want to ask the council after I've heard what the participants have to say. So if you want to just tell us your particular concerns, summarising your points. Obviously, we don't want repetition from your hearing statement, but if you can summarise your key points and on the back of what you've heard so far, if there are any particular comments that you want to make, then please do so now. And then if there are further comments you want to make after I've asked questions of the council on particular points, then you're more than welcome to do that as well. Okay, does that provide a bit of clarity?
Yes, thank you very much. Please interrupt me if I'm going off topic or something. I'm quite happy to be interrupted. My point was initially there was a comment just before the break with regard to the transport links and the train, in particular the train transit links. While I could understand the comments regarding the train line in Brentwood and Shenfield being a very good train line, my experience of it is that it does actually operate pretty much at capacity, and at Shenfield the trains that people like to get on are standing room only. So while obviously the line's very good, I'm not sure that really the capacity has properly been addressed. My other points were with regard to on question really 21B, which was about the having the policy that the council has of considering the transport links and the identification of where the development should be based on the transport, sustainable transport. And when I read the reports that are on that about sustainable transport, it seems to me, and my particular concern with regard to our residents is that the car transport links, because Brentwood and Shenfield are very congested at the moment. That's what the report says. And we've got very high CO2 emissions, and our road, like many other roads, is a rat run, effectively. And the way the spatial strategy has placed the development seems to be that most of the employment sites are down the A127 and Childerditch area. But aside from the Dunton Garden Village and West Horndon developments, a lot of the housing developments is on the other side of Brentwood and Shenfield. And I couldn't really see much evidence in the reports to substantiate the fact there will be much improved bus links. It's a bit absent on what they're going to do. So there will be a lot of traffic coming through Brentwood, which is going to increase the congestion, which is what the report says. And I actually, when I read the report, I think that it understates considerably the impact, because the strategies that are mentioned on the report for mitigating transport are very weak strategies. They're unlikely to have any real effects. There's a lot about walking and cycling and promoting those, which we currently do. So it's not that information isn't there, it's people don't choose to do that. And so the modelling has understated the traffic, and in fact there are data errors, which means that certain of the junctions incorrectly are reported as being under capacity when they're not. And if that is evidence that will be used to identify and to decide on sites, then it's not good evidence. And I just think that the council in the LDP has not actually produced a sustainable transport report in respect of car traffic. I think that probably sums up my concerns.
Thank you. No, that was summed up very succinctly. So thank you very much, Ms. Webster. And as I said, if there are any further comments you want to make, please just put up your hand, and we're more than happy. We want to hear from participants around the table. So thank you for that. I do want to go, I will be going to the council shortly, but Mr. Davey, you've put up your hand. Is it following on from the points that Ms. Webster has made?
Yes, that's correct, Inspector.
Mr. Davey, then, please.
It's in fact just to really agree with those comments that have been made. And myself and other colleagues from Basildon did actually have a meeting with Brentwood on November the 20th, where we did raise some transport concerns. It will be worth noting that the A127, of course, particularly in the Basildon area, does have quite poor air quality. But one of the concerns that we raised with them, bearing in mind that the starting point for the spatial strategy would be set out under paragraphs 102 and 103 of the NPPF, which requires that transport issues are given full consideration from the earliest stages of plan making. The concern is that if you need new bus links to be provided, especially at this time, what certainty is there that those services can actually be delivered, given that a lot of public transport companies are struggling because of COVID and the reduced revenues that's had? It certainly would make it less likely. And if there's a resulting increase in car use, then that would also be a concern, given the lack of general cross-boundary consideration that we think has taken place with regard to the effects of Dunton Hills Garden Village in particular.
Thank you, Mr. Davey. Right, so nobody else has got their hand up at the moment. What I wanted to do, it was actually quite good timing with what the two participants have just said there in relation to transport, because that's what I wanted to move on to, and some specific questions in relation to how transport issues have been taken into account in deciding on the spatial strategy. And where development, the location, the general location, not looking at specific sites, but the general location of development is taken on board. So a couple of questions to the council here, please. So I don't know if that's going to be towards Mr. Drain, or I'm sure Mr. Shadorevian will advise whether it will be towards other colleagues. It's very much about how, well, we'll start off with the improvements that have been made, or infrastructure improvements that have been made or are proposed to be made, and those are in the pipeline, and how those have influence, such as the Elizabeth Line improvements, etc. How has the council taken that on board in relation to deciding where development should go? As in, how much extra additional capacity have those improvements created, and does the strategy follow that? Or has that strategy taken that additional capacity with those improvements, those infrastructure improvements? So if I could have a response from the council on that point, please.
Mr. Drain will assist you, Madam.
Thank you.
Thank you, Inspector. I will answer that specific point, but also with some reference to some of the comments that have been made recently and just before the break, I think, in terms of where that's relevant. Of course, transport is a very important part of the reason why the spatial strategy is as it is, in the sense that, as we know, we're talking about two transit corridors that flow through the borough, and the way in which that's informed the spatial strategy. Coming to your question first, in terms of additional capacity that is created, I think, as we say in our hearing statements, we are mindful that the Elizabeth Line arriving to Brentwood and Shenfield, whilst is welcomed, is the existing service, essentially replacement of the existing service, notwithstanding the fact that clearly there is investment in that in terms of additional capacity that might come from longer trains, more frequent trains. The service remains as is, and clearly in terms of the role of Shenfield in particular, you've still got the choice of the fast train service to Stratford and Liverpool Street indeed. But in terms of that interconnecting with the wider Elizabeth Line, I think if you're choosing to travel from Shenfield and into London, you're probably making similar choices to what you make already now before the Elizabeth line comes out to Shenfield in particular, by the time that you would then take advantage of the Elizabeth line in terms of it flowing through London, for instance, and providing those new rail links that go through the heart of London. But I would come back in terms of that question of how we've taken account of the additional capacity and the way in which we're looking to grow in the borough, in terms of some points that were raised earlier with regard to what Mr. Hill said and Mr. Kimlin in terms of the way in which we've distributed growth through the spatial strategy. Clearly, again, we have 2 corridors that flow through the borough. It is worth noting that those corridors are very different in character and nature in terms of the existing settlements that are there. Clearly, what we're talking about with Brentwood and Shenfield, and indeed Ingatestone further up the rail line within the centre, and the difference within the south of the borough that is just West Horndon as a very small settlement. So the nature of those places are different to begin with. In terms of the way in which growth has therefore been spread, that is relevant. Mr. Hill set out that we were being misleading in the data that we provided through the hearing statement and other aspects, and I would just like to take issue with that and say that's not the case. I think if you read the context of what it is that we're saying, of course you can look at data and then look at the way in which the number of sites differ, and the number of sites would naturally differ in terms of the fact that the existing character, the lack of urban areas within the south compared to the centre, informs the number of sites that would be coming forward in those areas. And the size of the sites in terms of what is available when it comes to land take. But in terms of our revised housing trajectory that we've provided, we are clear on the numbers in terms of it relating to the number of new homes that would come forward and not just sites, for instance. So that breakdown would be roughly about 33% in the south of the borough, and that makes 77% in the centre of the borough. So very 67. Roughly again, we're talking 67. Sorry, we're talking about 1/3 compared to 2/3 of growth in terms of splitting that between the south and the centre. So that does reflect on the fact that we have services such as the Elizabeth line coming to Brentwood and Shenfield, and the growth that we're looking in and around Brentwood and Shenfield. And indeed the allocations that we have in terms of urban extensions and the way in which you would be able to walk to and from those stations, for instance, which are as far away in terms of distance and public transport links as what we're looking at in the south of the borough. So that being the point that we would raise in terms of how we've responded to the Elizabeth line, but also recognising that within the south of the borough we have a railway line there and investment there that we're looking at in terms of opportunities for physical expansion of West Horndon, and the way in which West Horndon is simpler to invest in terms of the investment that would be required from growth in that area to improve that station to the extent that it could then accommodate wider growth. Wider growth beyond that then needs to be considered within South Essex and the role of that line more broadly, but that's separate from this issue. And I'm happy to come back on some of the points that have been made regarding road infrastructure if we want to move on from rail.
I was just about to say that, yes, if you could do that as well, please.
So there were some points made in particular on the strategic highway network earlier by Mr. Henry regarding N25, Junction 28 and Junction 29. I would just say that we've clearly been working with Highways England on our proposals and the way in which the strategic highway network relates. There was a suggestion made that Highways England undertakes schemes to accommodate growth, which is not the case. The Highways England scheme at Junction 28 is to serve existing urban areas, and indeed it is to deal with capacity relief, not to accommodate growth. So importantly there, Junction 28 is already a junction that is significantly constrained, and thereby requiring the scheme that Highways England have set out to relieve some of that. We, of course, are looking at the implications of growth within the central growth corridor in terms of what is required over and above the Highways England plans to accommodate mitigation at that junction, which is set out within the transport assessment. Junction 29 is different in the sense that whilst the growth itself creates the need for mitigation, certain mitigations that we're looking at with our highways colleagues in terms of what that may look like. It is at the moment, in terms of Brentwood specifically, serving rural areas, thereby at the moment not requiring a significant amount of capacity and capacity relief in terms of any schemes that Highways England are bringing forward. Indeed, Lower Thames Crossing, when it does come forward, relieves a lot of the general flow issues that would come from growth within Brentwood and growth within the wider area. So we have that scheme to consider as well. And of course, comparing the two junctions is different because of the level of growth that we're looking at in the two locations. And importantly, my original point, the fact that you've got existing communities within those two corridors that are very different in population sense in a Brentwood context. I appreciate that there's a wider context as well to consider, which clearly Highways England are thinking about. We're thinking about a Brentwood context. So I think that's all relevant to the way in which we've tried to distribute the growth. It is, of course, transport is an important part, but it is also related to the existing communities that are there and the land availability that is there in terms of being able to accommodate that growth when we've got two, what we would say are sustainable from a transport perspective, locations to consider for new development.
And the comments have been made about specifics about air quality. Some participants are saying that the assessments in relation to air quality don't go deep enough. They're a bit too generalised, and they're not looking. And you're not looking at mitigation measures that will then allow development to occur, or more development to occur within the Brentwood urban area, for instance, because of the issues of air quality that are there. Others are saying actually the air quality is poor in those areas, as you've specified, and therefore there's only a certain amount of development that could occur there. So have potential mitigation measures been considered as part of that consideration of the spatial strategy in relation to air quality, for instance? I know we're talking about air quality on a different sessions, but I don't want to get into too much detail here. But again, it's cross-cutting.
Yes, thank you, Inspector. Air quality is one of those difficult ones in the sense that, of course, you only measure it where you've got existing issues or communities whereby you're looking at that as something that is to be mitigated. So again, I would say that there are differences compared to the centre and the south according to the way in which we measure air quality and the nature of Brentwood Town Centre, for instance, as an area where you would have lower air quality because of the amount of car traffic moving through an urban area in comparison to the south of the borough, where generally you've got cars flowing along the A127 when it flows. That thereby don't create that same issue. I would say that we have considered that in terms of the fact that what the plan is trying to do is to try and introduce and encourage sustainable transport measures wherever possible. So to promote the use of public transport where we have existing urban areas, and we're talking about being able to walk to Brentwood or Shenfield Station, or the fact that you have bus services that are existing, that would support the fact that those areas are sustainable places to grow because of those existing services that are there, notwithstanding the difficulties that individual bus operators may have moving forward with regard to public transport, which is clearly a much bigger issue that we as a nation need to think about how we can get back to a place where public transport is again something that we are increasing use of. In terms of the points that have been made around Dunton Hills, for instance, and that issue that Mr. Davey raised around the use of bus services there, that is where we've done a significant amount of work on the sustainable transport vision for that area and the principles of Dunton Hills Garden Village that would bring forward more sustainable transport modes, changing the culture, if I can put it that way, of generally Essex, which has a high reliance on cars, changing that culture to be more about walking, cycling, jumping on the bus, whatever it may be first before you jump in your own car. And that is more difficult to achieve in existing urban areas. And with urban extensions, we believe it is more possible to achieve quickly in a new community that instills that principle from the very beginning, which is the whole point of Dunton Hills Garden Village. And of course, it is not just about thinking about bus services in the sense of traditional use of buses where you have timetables and bus stops and such. There is a role, of course, as part of the wider public transport piece to have as that, but we've also thought about new ways of public transport that are being introduced more recently in terms of the more on-demand sense of a bus service and the way in which the wider area, including Basildon, could really accommodate that type of use, whereby I don't want to oversimplify it. There are many transport planners who know much more than me on this subject, but the type of Uber style bus service, and that's very much simplifying what the offer is. But we've started to think about that with colleagues in terms of the highways authorities, as well as the developers bringing forward Dunton Hills Garden Village and other developments in that wider area, as well as the actual operators who undertake those types of services, to think about the viability and the way in which Brentwood may be an area that they would be interested in. So it is a factor, of course, and that kind of management of issues around air quality all sort of come into that. And so it's that cultural shift that we're looking to try and make through the new development proposals that we have and the policies within the plan, that we would hope will eventually, slowly over time, begin to reduce the use of single-use cars and thereby air quality issues. I don't want to get into much more detail than that, but of course we also need to be mindful of the fact that technology is changing as well, and so it's the way in which we can encourage, for instance, technological improvements, electric vehicle infrastructure, whatever it may be, that then means that all of a sudden we're not having a debate about air quality, we're continuing to have the debate about perhaps congestion and other aspects of car use, for instance.
Thank you. The point that Ms. Webster raised about, so I will come to you, Ms. Webster, shortly, but there's some others as well. Just to respond to Ms. Webster's point about the location of development, so employment in the south, the vast majority, not all of it. I understand. Obviously, there's locations in the northern part as well, but to a much smaller degree. The strategic allocations are to the south. And Ms. Webster's concerns in relation to the amount of traffic that would come through, or the amount of additional travel that would come through Brentwood to get down to those locations. Council's response on that?
Thank you, Inspector. I think the Council's been very mindful of what Ms. Webster and the Residents Association are concerned by in terms of Priest Lane. I would come back on the specific points that were raised to say that the transport assessment, as we've looked through in detail with Essex County Council, fairly represents the number of cars that would be moving through those locations and the capacity and sort of the way in which the junctions operate. However, the council, in terms of Priest Lane specifically in that site, have been mindful of the concerns about Priest Lane as a road itself and the nature of it, and that sort of it's the way it's been built up over time. It has more of a rural nature within an urban area. So that being, and I know we'll come on to it specifically when we're talking about sites, so not going into it now, but that being the reason why the council has looked to try and reduce the number of homes on that site, for instance, to in some way recognise the concerns of residents about the impact of growth in that location. But in terms of flows, it's an important point that the transport assessment tries to take account of, is to accurately understand the flow of traffic as it goes through a place like Brentwood, which of course is constrained by the fact that it is an old road network that ultimately has a north-south route running through the centre at Wilson's Corner in particular, which is a particular issue when it comes to junction capacity and the way in which flows of traffic flow around the borough. So by nature, that is why we are trying to, in addition to looking at appropriate sustainable growth options within the centre of the borough, to consider the south of the borough in order to relieve some of that pressure and to spread that growth, as we've been talking about. In terms of the way in which employment sites have come forward, it really is based on land availability. And the way in which land has come forward for employment land, which has been more limited in the centre of the borough. And I think that is in reaction to the points that I've made earlier about it being an existing area of predominantly housing growth, housing locations. It's an existing urban areas within the central corridor that are predominantly housing focused, with some employment spots dropped around, and I know there are separate questions that you've asked specifically about the redevelopment of existing employment sites in those types of areas that we'll come on to. So in terms of that question there about the A127 in particular, it is the role of, so for instance, Childerich Industrial Park, which is an existing employment location which has the potential to be expanded. But most importantly, I suppose the thing being referred to is Brentwood Enterprise Park, the fact that that is a large development site, clearly much larger than any other employment site that we are proposing within the plan. So by nature, we recognise in terms of new employment growth more of an emphasis on that being delivered in the south compared to the centre. That is predominantly as a result of the land availability that we have, the land that's coming forward, and the appropriateness to locate larger sites which reflect the kind of the market demand now for that type of employment land not being available in comparative terms in the same way as it is in the south.
Thank you. I know you've mentioned a couple of specific sites, etc. there, so I don't want a discussion on those particular sites, not at this stage. We will be moving on to those shortly. Thank you for that, Mr. Drain. Can I come to Mr. Fennell? I do apologise if somebody's put their hand up first, but I will do the list in accordance with, yeah, I think it was Mr. Fennell first, so I will do Mr. Fennell, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. The discussion's moved on a little bit quicker than I was anticipating it would, so I wonder if you would allow me to briefly comment on some of the comments that were made before the break, and I also want to comment on something that Mr. Drain has just said.
Yes, that's fine. Yes,
thank you very much.
That's fine.
Firstly, in relation to the discussion before the break, EA Strategic's position in its hearing statement is that their preference is for option 6, which is a combination of development at Dunton and West Horndon. Mr. Kimbling, in what he said, he stated that further and additional development should be supported, and presumably that's in addition to the strategic allocations. So whilst they make comments about the spatial strategy, I think it's also their view that emission sites should be included over and above strategic allocations. In relation to some of the accessibility points made both this morning and by Mr. Drain, if you go down the garden community route, it will inevitably be somewhere where new facilities and linkages have got to be provided. Mr. Drain made reference to the cultural shift point, and I agree with that. Maybe that's something that we can discuss more fully in Matter 6 next week. I think that would be appropriate time to discuss that. But just as West Horndon, development at West Horndon would benefit from proximity to the rail station, so does Dunton Hills. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. Mr. Hill, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I've got 3 short, if I can make these now, ma'am, and I'd also just like to bring in Mr. Henry on one additional matter. First, winding back, ma'am, to where you started, which was the Elizabeth line. You've heard now that the investment in the Elizabeth line, which we know is committed investment, is going to give rise, amongst other things, to longer and more frequent trains serving Brentwood and Shenfield right at the heart of this local authority area. This is committed investment there to improve the services running right through the central corridor and connecting these communities with Stratford, Liverpool Street and all that lies beyond. Our main point remains that this has really not factored in sufficiently to the thinking that underpins this plan. The C2C line at West Horndon is never going to compare with this. It seems to us that the balance remains inappropriate, disproportionate, and patently wrong. And we would ask you and your colleague to consider this factor very carefully indeed. Second, ma'am, in relation to the stats, the data, Of course, it can be presented in a variety of ways. My point about paragraph 41 is correct, but looking at the November trajectory, the most recent trajectory we've got from the council, in relation to allocated land allocated in the plan, the majority of completions are still expected to come forward in the southern corridor. Last point in relation to air quality and congestion. It's very easy to say there's a problem and allocating any more land in the vicinity of Brentwood would exacerbate the problem. That isn't in fact borne out by scrutiny of the proposals that were advanced at the appropriate stages. I know you don't want to get into the details, but just by way of example, our proposals introduced a bypass to the main area of congestion in the centre of Brentwood. So it's not as simple as saying more at Brentwood inevitably means more air quality problems. Ma'am, I'd just like to defer to Mr. Henry, who I know wants to come back on one point.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. It was just a very quick one to reiterate the point I was making regarding M25 Junction 28 and 29 and the fact there is much detail and certainty at present around Junction 28 and little detail and therefore uncertainty with respect to improvements, whatever they may be, at Junction 29, which I don't think was contended. But the point that did seem to be challenged was around enabling allowance for and enabling future growth. And I would just refer to the DCO, the transport assessment and work that has been done for the DCO, dated by Highways England, dated May 2020, the M25 Junction 28 improvement scheme. The environmental statement, the non-technical summary, paragraph 1.2.3, page 6, and that's document 6.4. It specifically goes through a list of considerations that scheme would take account of in its improvements. And one specific point stated is to cater for future traffic demands to enable development and economic growth. So it's quite clear that the intentions of the scheme, not just in terms of the baseline and predicted challenges that node would have, but it's actually looking to the future traffic demands as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hill, was there anything further? You still got your hand up. Anything?
I've taken it down, ma'am. I do apologise.
I just didn't know if you wanted to say anything further after Mr. Henry spoke.
No, thank you, ma'am.
Lovely, thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Hollingworth, please?
Thank you, ma'am. I just wanted to add to Mr. Drain's very thorough explanation of how the strategy was appropriate from a transport perspective, and I'll seek to do so whilst avoiding mentioning specific sites, but it was just in respect of the location of employment land and the spatial strategy in that regard. And it does link in with some of the points raised by Ms. Webster and Mr. Davey as well. Clearly, the availability of suitable sites is a consideration, but as you will see from our Regulation 19 representations and our hearing statement, it's clear that a key factor in the spatial strategy here has been the proximity to the strategic highway network where the employment land has been focused, and the benefits that will have in terms of reducing additional pressure on the local highway network, which can lead to congestion and potential air quality issues. So I just wanted to make clear it's not just about the availability of suitable sites. And just as by way of example, adding to Mr. Jane's point about sort of the Uber-style public transport, I think if that's the phrase. But yes, that's very much the intention and the requirement that those employment sites would be accompanied by that demand-responsive transport as well. So just wanted to make those points. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. And I will just reiterate that other on-demand companies are available.
Yeah, thank you, Mum. I was tempted to say that, but I couldn't think of one. So, yeah.
So to ensure we're not advertising certain companies, so I'll do that. Can I bring in Mr. Robinson, please?
Thank you, Inspector. Just wanted to clarify a point about the transport assessment, as stated in a previous session. We're still working with Brentwood Borough Council on that, so we're not in a position to finalise that transport assessment and the IDP work.
Yes, obviously we had that discussion yesterday, didn't we? And I know that the council is going to give an indication of when that's, or when certain information may become available that we can have a look at in advance of the actual transport assessment, the updated transport assessment becoming available. Is there anything that you've heard today in relation to the comments that have been made about congestion and the traffic modelling that you can add to, or are your comments very much in relation to no, we would like to wait until we've seen the, we've read through and commented and made amendments to the updated transport assessment?
Yeah, the latter, I'm afraid. We've asked for further information.
I have to admit, I know we're, as inspectors, we're not allowed to assume, but I had sort of assumed that because of this updated transport assessment. So thank you just for providing that clarity. Okay, thank you. It's certainly something we're going to be coming back to, transport issues. We have, as I said, we've got infrastructure sessions, and transport issues will be dealt with, will be discussed as part of site allocations as well. So that was certainly, it's not just going to be discussed now, so it will be raised later on. So thank you for that. Can I just clarify again, just it may be something that's more relevant to one of the site-specific considerations when we come to consider the Brentwood Enterprise Park in particular, and the development around that locality, the Lower Thames Crossing and the implications of that. In relation to the spatial strategy, I don't really, again, I'm trying not to discuss specific sites at this stage because I want to try and just focus on the soundness of the strategy as in its entirety first. But have those implications been taken on board?
Thank you, Inspector. Yes,
Thank
indeed.
You.
The Lower Thames Crossing is considered within the transport assessment work. Just to clarify, without getting into detail, in terms of Lower Thames Crossing, it really only impacts junction 29 and the slip roads as they relate to the A127 when it comes to Brentwood. But clearly that's important in terms of flows and the way in which sites can come forward.
So that's something that once the updated transport assessment becomes available, then we'll be able to have a look at that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so that is included within the transport assessment work that has been published, but indeed it will also be in the new work, as well as some of the revised and taken further forward drawings of what junction 29 looks like in relation to the Lower Thames Crossing proposals, as well as the mitigation that may be required from development.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. And can you just confirm, because obviously it has been raised by Basildon in relation to the A127, we did draw on this yesterday, in relation to when the spatial strategy decided, or where the council decided as part of its spatial strategy to put a large amount or a significant amount of development along the A127, was consideration given to the implications for that for neighbouring authorities, particularly Basildon with its issues on air quality and the issues that Mr. Davey has raised. So I'm looking at the cumulative effects then, really, isn't it, of the
yes.
of your spatial strategy on the impact on adjacent authorities.
Specific to transport.
Specific to transport.
Yes, indeed. Within the transport assessment, we've looked at cumulative growth from adjoining areas in terms of what is being planned as best as can be done at this point. Indeed, the air quality issue in Basildon has more recently become something of an issue, if I can put it that way, compared to not that what didn't exist before, but obviously with the local plan examination in Basildon now particularly considering that issue, that is more of a recent thing. But indeed, we looked at the cumulative impacts of growth that we are proposing as they relate to the A127 specifically and other roads, and how that cross-boundary implications are considered. I think that just does go back to the importance of bringing forward a garden village community concept in terms of that cultural shift and change that has been mentioned in comparison to loading more growth onto existing urban areas where that change is going to be more difficult in the short term.
And sort of moving, I suppose it's still linked with the transport issues, and just staying with the implications of the spatial strategy for Basildon. And I'm sure we'll go further into this when we deal with matter 6. But the decision to locate a garden village within the borough, and then obviously a decision made to locate it at Dunton Hills. Comments have been made about the implications that, yes, that's proposed to be a garden village, so there will be an element of self-sustaining facilities and services provided, because that's part of the narrative of providing a garden village. And we will come on to discussing all of that as part of matter 6 and onwards. But again, comments have been made about, well, yes, there will be facilities there, but there will also be a need to travel elsewhere in whatever way to access other facilities, and that Basildon is the closest community, the closest settlement, and that people aren't going to be going to Brentwood for these facilities because Basildon's literally round the corner. So in terms of looking at that, can I just understand the council's just understanding about the implications of deciding to put a garden village location or a large proportion of development in that area, and the implications for adjacent neighbouring authorities, and what I know we're looking back over what was discussed yesterday, and I don't want a repeat of what we discussed there, but those discussions that have happened with Basildon on that.
Thank you, Inspector.
Mr. Drain again. Yeah.
Yes. So I think, without getting into matter 6, when I think we'll cover this in more depth, the history of Dunton Hills, for instance, and the way in which it came forward, and the role of joint Basildon and Brentwood growth, and those aspects that meant there clearly was discussion about the overall impacts between us from the very beginning. We understand the Basildon perspective, which is one of concern about local facilities and services being used, whereby beyond the sort of local facilities that you would find within the new community, which we think would help it to be self-sustaining, we're not unrealistic to the fact that clearly some people, many people will have cars, many people will go and drive to places elsewhere, as well as hopefully choose to jump on the train, which would be 1-2 stops to Basildon or other areas of South Essex, as well as London, of course, on the other side. It goes both ways, in the sense that, of course, that has been considered within the evidence. We don't think that is a situation which is causing rise to any significant concern on the levels of flows and things like that on the A127, notwithstanding the fact that we understand the road is very busy, and wider growth, clearly, when you look at those cumulative impacts, require investment in the road, and something that I know County Council, as well as ourselves and adjoining authorities and Highways England, are all thinking about what the future role of that road and wider corridor is, in terms of trying to encourage more than just jumping in your car, for instance. But of course, it does have other potential benefits as well to Basildon in terms of the local economy, use of those services, people going to shop, whatever it may be. So it does work both ways, but we do understand the concerns, and we have engaged with Basildon, and we are happy to continue to engage with our partners in Basildon to think through the more detailed aspects of what that looks like as the development comes forward. So again, we'll deal with this at matter 6, but when we're thinking about specific master planning of the community, that is a factor. That is something that is being considered within the design of the new community, along with Basildon colleagues being involved in that process.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. I've got a number of hands up. I will go to Mr. Banner, please, first.
Thank you, Madam. Just very quickly, I need to come back on something Mr. Fennell said, because he may have inadvertently given a false impression of what our case is. Just in case he has, let me be clear. Our position is that a spatial strategy founded on strategic growth in the Southern Corridor based upon Dunton is not justified within the meaning of your question 21. A spatial strategy founded on strategic growth in that corridor at West Horndon would be, and in the alternative, one founded on West Horndon and Dunton would be for the reasons I explained earlier and in those passages. So just want to be very clear on that, because otherwise that comment may be left hanging and it might have been said that I've accepted it, which I don't.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Banner. Mr. Kimblin, please.
Thank you. Likewise, a very short point responding to something said earlier, in this case by Mr. Drain. And it was in the context of, you'll recall, the split of development north-south, and we had a little bit of maths in that regard. I just wanted to put in this observation that in FD 5, the council's housing supply paper, they update figure 4.2 from the plan, which deals with housing numbers in various parts of the district. And rather than 2/3, 1/3, which was advanced by Mr. Drain, we would draw attention to evidently that now 34% south Dunton Hills. But when one looks at Brentwood, and this is the key point, what one has in fact is a mere 25%, comprising, according to the most up-to-date tables, 10% brownfield and 15% greenbelt. So the reality of the situation is 34% south, and so far as we're interested in the most sustainable part of the district, Brentwood, it's 25%. So I wouldn't concede Mr. Drain's approach of 2/3, 1/3, because one needs to be much more fine-grained about understanding where development is going outside of that southern area. That was a short point.
Thank you. Mr. Stebbing, please.
Ma'am, are you taking contributions at the moment on the whole of question 21, or are you taking them in sequence A, B, C, D, etc.?
I was trying to take them in sequence, but I'm more than happy to take it in its entirety, because some people haven't actually looked at each individual element. They've taken it as the question as a whole. So I'm more than happy to take it as in its entirety, Mr. Stebbing.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm really addressing point F, but it does cut across a number of the other points. And I'm sorry if this sounds rather repetitious, but my main thrust on F, I think will depend very greatly on the note that you've requested earlier this morning on the settlement hierarchy. And firstly, a clarification on that, if I may. Are you expecting the council to address all settlements in that hierarchy, including Brentwood, etc.?
Yes. Is the answer. Yes.
Good, and I hope that was the answer. And the follow-up from
what's
that,
in the settlement hierarchy, yes. And I know we do realise some settlements aren't in that hierarchy because they're washed over by the greenbelt.
yes,
But that's a different,
yes,
element.
and we'll maybe save that for another day. But the full list of settlements that are in the hierarchy as is.
Yes.
So the conversations that we've just had on essentially transportation infrastructure, but I think we can broaden out to other aspects of infrastructure, community infrastructure, social infrastructure, etc., recreation and leisure, I think will need to be addressed as well as transportation. What's concerning me is that a status quo assessment will be made of such infrastructure, and quite clearly there are some actually major improvements, particularly on transportation, being proposed across the borough, and we've touched on most of those, and I won't go over them again. Those improvements may well justify revisions to the settlement hierarchy, and you've heard me say that possibly already this morning, and that's the preliminary view that I've got, that the note that will be produced may well lead myself and hopefully yourselves to that sort of conclusion in terms of sustainability. So my main plea is that the note you've requested is robust, is comprehensive in terms of how it measures accessibility, existing infrastructure, proposed new infrastructure for all of those settlements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stebbing, and thank you for that reminder to the council to ensure that the note is as I've not asked for, some settlement appraisals can be highly significant and go into immense detail, and I'm not proposing that that is necessary in this case, but I do want the key points highlighted for each settlement in relation to the facilities that are there, the accessibility, etc. And it's absolutely right when you're talking about a plan that is setting out future development to highlight where improvements are being made in relation to, because that otherwise why is Dunton Hills in there? Because it doesn't exist at the moment. So it's in there because of the this is the council's point in their plan, is because that's a proposal based on the level of services that are going to be proposed, but they're not there at the moment. So therefore it would only be right if there are any other elements, and whether Dunton Hills should be in that settlement hierarchy is another question at the moment, because it doesn't exist at the moment. Because it is, and that's been included, then any other improvements that are set out in terms of services, whether it be transport or other facilities, then those need to be taken into account for the other settlements. So I will be expecting that as part of the note. Yeah, so does that allay your fears that the note won't actually?
Yes, it does. And
what is necessary?
Obviously, we all acknowledge that Dunton Hills will have to deal with a set of proposals rather than an existing situation.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Right, Ms. Webster, please.
I just wanted to comment because I think it was Mr. Kimblin made some comments regarding the settlement and the proportion that's split, where it's split. And maybe I've misinterpreted his comments, but I get the idea that he feels that there should be further development within the Brentwood and Shenfield centres. And I just want to reiterate that I don't think that the evidence that's been put up really supports that with regard to infrastructure. Although I spoke earlier mainly about transport, and being somebody who lives and has children and people who work in Brentwood, we have a lot of problems in Brentwood, and none of the plans, as I said earlier, none of the plans really are effective. And the facilities, because there are several schools all located in a small area, but they are operating, as I understand it, pretty much at capacity. I'm not sure that unless you're looking at improving those facilities, which I haven't seen any reference to anywhere, I can't see the justification in any of the evidence for increasing building within the town centres. In fact, I would possibly say, and this touched on matter 3, which I'm not really involved in, but I think the emphasis on preserving the green belt, when there is actually a lot of green belt land available, and some of it quite poor quality, preserving that at the cost to the residents in the urban town centres seems to me to be the wrong priorities, that they've prioritised the green belt without regard to the actual environment that the people live in within the town centres, which doesn't have really good transport links, public transport links, other than the trains, and it's unlikely to improve. And my concern as a resident is, and it's not just with relation to my site, I know Mr. Drain commented on the fact that we represent one site, but actually our residents are able to look at Brentwood and the experience of living in Brentwood and Shenfield at a much broader level, and able to look at the direction the community is going in. And it is not a pleasurable one, to be honest. It is not enjoyable to live in a town that has poor congestion and air quality, and we can't see that that's going to get any better as a result of the development. So I personally think, and I think I represent my residents, that actually we don't think that focusing any more development within the town centres than is stated, and possibly even too much is focused in the centre, is justifiable.
Thank you very much for that. What I wanted to do, I know that some people has responded to the questions by looking at the entirety of question 21. But what I did want to do is well, I've got the comments. I was just going to come to point G, which is about the reliance on most of the growth being in a small number of larger strategic sites. However, I don't think that's necessarily a discussion for today. I think that's more about delivery, which is more about land supply and provision. And we can discuss those matters as part of site allocations. Obviously, matter 6, it will be very much discussed as part of that. And we do have housing provision sessions looking specifically at supply in its totality in our week 3. So unless there's any other particular points that anybody raises, I wasn't going to open up a large discussion on that particular point because it will be covered later on. What I wanted to raise, I suppose it's coming to my point H in the question, which is in relation to, and we've discussed the vitality of the urban area. That element has been discussed, but it's the vitality of the rural economy as well, and how the council has considered that. It comes back to the settlement hierarchy. It comes back to the discussions that we've already had, and in relation to why some settlements have been given a little bit of development, some haven't, and I just wanted to just understand from the council's perspective how the council has looked at that in terms of vitality, and I know that comments have been made about that some rural settlements are going to end up dying or whatever because there isn't going to be any additional development, therefore there won't be additional services, therefore how can those developments exist, those settlements survive, etc. Can I just have the council's views on those comments that have been made on and how the spatial strategy has looked at the rural economy and the vitality of rural settlements?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I think that is something that the council has been very mindful of. I think as you look through the number of consultations on the plan over time, you can see the evolution of the spatial strategy that reflects on that issue in particular, and the difficulty of sort of focusing completely growth on urban areas within transport corridors at the expense of looking at smaller sites perhaps coming forward in villages that are outside of those areas. And so we look to the strategy to see whether there were opportunities to bring forward certain development around villages. In reality, we know as a result of doing that, we end up in a situation now whereby there are lots of people who are unhappy with either the fact that growth is happening near to them or the fact that growth may not be happening. And that is, I think, as a consequence of the fact that it is very difficult to I would say it's impossible to equally distribute growth around those villages when we are sort of working from a situation of where land availability is, where sites are coming forward, where they're being promoted, and where we would consider them to be acceptable on the basis of the spatial strategy that fundamentally looks to contain urban extensions, when we're talking about extensions to villages, within boundaries that can then define those new extensions and define a clear boundary between the village and the greenbelt as a result of the new development. So in particular, and I know, as you've said, we will come on to this when we do site specifics, Blackmore is an example whereby there are, we think, sites that can come forward that perform that in terms of suitability. There are other sites that we think we can justify, but generally there are limited amounts of opportunities, limited amounts of sites that are coming forward through site assessment process, people proposing land and land that is available, that then means that we could equally distribute that to each and every village. So it is a balance of trying to ensure that not only with extensions to villages, we might see brownfield redevelopment through the plan more generally, and opportunities that would look to utilise existing brownfield land, existing land within the urban areas specifically. And of course, those economic opportunities as well when it comes to the rural economy and the points that we'll come on to when we talk about the rural economy more specifically, and the way in which, for instance, diversification of business uses can occur and does occur very well in Brentwood. So it's encouraging that type of thing.
Talking about that, that'll be tomorrow.
Yes, of course.
Yep. We've got employment. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Drain, for that. Are there any comments on that particular element that anybody wants to raise? Ms. Bryan, please.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to sort of make a specific comment on the vitality of the rural communities, and our strong view is the strategy to focus on the main urban areas and the strategic sites won't support a prosperous rural economy. As the council set out in their hearing statement, only 2 of the 6 category 3 settlements have been offered the opportunity to grow and thrive in line with the NPPF. And as submitted, the plan did allow for redevelopment of brownfield sites, and that has now been removed. So with the plan period extending to 2033, the current approach will basically mean no new development for the other 4 category 3 settlements for the next 13 years. It will result in a moratorium of growth in some villages, which will deny them the benefits growth can bring, including bringing in a greater younger population, which would enhance and maintain their vitality. We just feel like the opportunity to help these villages and diversify the rural economy has been missed.
Thank you, Ms. Bryan. I'll bring in Ms. Adams as well, and then I'll come back to the council for a response on that. Ms. Adams, please.
Thank you. I was going to mention a number of points that Ms. Bryan has mentioned, but in terms of just some additional evidence, I mean, it's in paragraph 2.31 of the local plan that there is an ageing population in Brentwood, and that is something that we ought to consider when looking at growth of these settlements. At the moment, there's 1% of growth going to this rural northern fringe, and I just question whether that will actually, as Ms. Bryan has mentioned, actually result in thriving, prosperous rural communities. I think it's document C22, Heart of Essex Growth Scenarios. Chapter 7 specifically looked at the effect of keeping population stable and concluded that there were a number of effects that would happen to community facilities, schools, commuters, bus services, and I think those are all relevant points that need to be considered. And I just don't feel that, I appreciate what Mr. Drain has said in terms of the difficulty of getting that balance between green belts and allowing these settlements to grow, but I'm just not convinced personally that balance is quite right when, as Ms. Bryan has said, we're talking about a number of settlements not having any growth over the entire plan period.
Thank you. Would the council, Mr. Drain, anything further to add to the comments that you've made, having heard those comments?
Thank you, Inspector. I think the council certainly would sympathise with those views. I think it is, as has been expressed, a difficult balance between the level of growth required in order to come back to those points of enabling thriving rural communities, compared with the level of development that would be needed to achieve that, and therefore, the level of greenbelt change and extension to those villages. And then, of course, coming back to the sort of principle of what we've been discussing today around transport connectivity fundamentally, and I very much take Mr. Stebbing's view as well, that this goes way beyond just transport. This is about a number of infrastructure services in the widest sense. So that relates to what we've been talking about in terms of the transport corridors, but also, of course, the villages and more rural areas. It is that balance between how much growth is needed in order to truly achieve the levels of what we're talking about in terms of continuing prosperity of villages, compared with the sustainability of those villages in terms of justifying why you'd have that level of growth in those locations. So I would just say that what we've tried to do is to measure that in terms of small sites coming forward where that we consider them to be suitable. Of course, what it doesn't stop is the redevelopment of existing brownfield urban area sites as well, in terms of what the plan is looking to do. And of course, exception sites as well, which I appreciate we'll come on to in terms of Greenbelt specifically, but the opportunity for that type of development on a smaller scale to bring forward new growth in those communities. But notwithstanding what I've just said there about that debate between is small scale development going to achieve the sort of higher aspirations of continuing to keep local villages thriving without large scale development. If your perspective is that you need lots of development to achieve that, we're looking at a complete change of the character of those villages, which I bring us back to is a fundamental part of the spatial strategy, the village character of the borough and maintaining that.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. What I would like to do now is draw the discussion this morning to some form of end in relation to the sustainability appraisal. I've just got a couple of points I want to bring on to some specific policy points in relation to SPO1 and SPO2. SPO2 is in relation to the spatial strategy. And then I just want to go through a couple of points on SPO1. Has anybody got anything further they wish to add at this stage? Because I am looking to finishing this session this morning, so it won't continue this afternoon. So because I'm coming to the end of the notes that I've got to complete. So if anybody has got anything further they wish to say, then please raise your hands. And I've got one hand up. So Ms. Bryan, please.
Thank you. I had a specific point to make on question 21D about brownfield land. Is this an appropriate moment to make? Yes, I presume absolutely. It is. Just so my client's particular concern is that effective use hasn't been made of brownfield land as a result of the site selection process, which we don't think is robust. At stage 2 of the assessment, the methodology discounted sites which were considered to be unsustainable prior to considering the potential to use brownfield. The council's hearing statement says that they discounted previously developed land in isolated greenbelt locations, but what they actually did was exclude all sites that weren't physically attached to an urban area, regardless of how close they were to the urban area. So a lot of brownfield sites have been discounted for any assessment of the positive uses of brownfield development made. And there's a greenbelt point here. I know you're discussing that tomorrow, but I'm not participating tomorrow. I thought it would be more sensible to say everything once today. Basically, sites that are sequentially preferable in greenbelt have therefore been dismissed ahead of any detailed assessment contribution they make. Looking at the Greenbelt topic paper, that makes clear that the site selection process departed from the sequential approach to Greenbelt, and that sites were not selected for allocation in order to minimise harm to the Greenbelt. So we don't think the evidence base is robust in this regard, and don't believe that effective use has been made of brownfield land. And in failing to make effective use of brownfield land, exceptional circumstances haven't been demonstrated by the scale of the proposed. I'm not disputing that greenbelt release is necessary, but it is the scale of greenbelt release before all brownfield options are considered. I think that was it for now. Thank you.
So is your comment in relation to brownfield land within the greenbelt or brownfield land per se?
Yes,
in urban areas?
Brownfield land within the Greenbelt was discounted much earlier in the site selection process. The ones within and adjoining urban areas were obviously taken through the whole process and considered.
Okay. Thank you. That's something that it will certainly be discussed on Friday, which is when we're discussing Greenbelt. Thank you. Mr. Drain, any response on those points that Ms. Bryan has just raised?
No, I think if you're happy
towards Greenbelt territory.
Sorry, yes, absolutely, Inspector.
Trying to stay away from today.
If you're minded to cover that on Friday, then we're happy to respond to that issue. Then.
Okay. Although I suppose a slight response to Ms. Bryan in case there is anything else she needs to add, because if she's not coming in on the Greenbelt discussion on Friday, that might be useful actually to just give a general response.
Okay. Thank you, Inspector. I think what Ms. Bryan says in terms of understanding and not speaking of the specific site, but we understand the context of what's being suggested there about use of brownfield land within the Greenbelt. I think fundamentally we've looked again at the spatial strategy to think through where are the most sustainable locations if we are looking at brownfield land within the Greenbelt, and where can we make sure that we are redrawing the Greenbelt boundary wherever we are needing to or having to sort of look at those brownfield opportunities. Where we can do so by redrawing the line around existing urban areas. So in other words, urban extensions into the Greenbelt to take account of brownfield opportunities. So it comes down to, I think, sustainability in terms of the isolated location of those types of developments that are not connected to existing urban areas. Thereby, we would consider them to be fairly isolated and by their nature, not particularly sustainable. So they have been treated much the same as greenfield land within the Greenbelt in the sense of the way in which sustainability and location principles have been applied. But of course, there are examples of brownfield land within the Greenbelt being proposed where we consider them to be in sustainable locations. The exceptions clearly are in terms of strategic growth, as we would look at the brownfield location of Brentwood Enterprise Park, as well as Dunton Hills coming forward as a new garden village community, thereby requiring something that is not connected to an existing urban area. So I'd make that point. But I understand the point being made about the overall site assessment. I would just say that we feel that we've taken appropriate steps to assess sites according to whether they are within sustainable locations connected to existing urban areas.
Ms. Bryan, anything further on? Obviously, if you're not coming along to the Friday session, is there anything you want to add for us to take into consideration?
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if you can bear with me, we will slightly go over 1 o'clock, but as long as everybody's happy with that, because it saves us coming back after lunch instead. Again, I know the council is looking at policy SPO2. Just get it in front of me. To consider and they've already put forward suggestions for altering that. I just wanted, again, and just to clarify, and I think I did say this earlier this morning in relation to ensuring that the spatial strategy within that policy is clear, because I know that we're not looking at the Part A. Part A is going to be discussed tomorrow, obviously, as part of housing requirement and meeting housing needs. But it's the Part B of the policy, which I don't think that clearly sets out the strategy well enough. It certainly doesn't appear to be effective in that. So it's just to clarify. I don't really want a discussion about it, but just to clarify, that's what I was sort of getting at, really, is in relation to that part of the strategy there, or that part of the policy. Now, I also would like to just go through SPO1, which is the Sustainable Development Policy that you've got in your plan. Now, again, I'm not quite sure where this policy has come from, because in the olden days, there used to be a model policy from PINS that had to go into a plan. That is no longer the case. there is no requirement to have a sustainable development policy in the plan. And in fact, the framework actually says repetition of national policy should not occur, because actually you've got to be very, very careful that you are absolutely consistent with the policy that is set out within the framework. So I'm always a little bit wary of policies that are trying to state what national policy is saying. And I know that the council is putting forward some suggested amendments. I think that's in your 11, if I can bring that up. Yes, where you that's in response to our initial questions, where we were concerned that the policy where we were concerned that some policies seemed to be a statement of intent rather than actually this could be how can a decision maker or an applicant or a resident read this as an actual requirement? What are the requirements of the policy? So I know that the council has put those forward as suggestions. I'm just raising it now as to whether the council's view, and there are still some issues with some of the wording there. Does the council require this policy to be in the plan? Because I'm worried about the effectiveness of it and its consistency with national policy if it's trying to be the same or trying to repeat national policy, whether it's as helpful as it seems or whether it's actually not that helpful. So if I could just ask the council for a response on that. What I'm asking is whether it should be in, whether it shouldn't. And obviously I will give a direction on that if necessary, but I'd like to understand the council's view on that first, please.
Looking at it objectively, I think one has to question whether it's necessary or whether it ought to form part of the lower text in the plan. The supporting text. And I think there's an argument to say that much of that could be, because many of the matters identified under paragraph D actually are dealt with more specifically in policies that follow.
They're dealt with in policies. That was going to be one of the points that I was going to raise. What does this add? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that a plan is unsound if it includes repetition of national policy. Absolutely, it depends on, although I don't particularly like it, I have to admit, because it's again causing that issue of whether repetition is useful or not, and whether it's effective. So there is that element. So is the council content to go away and potentially remove that policy, as long as you are content that elements of it are included elsewhere within the plan?
We are indeed happy to look at that. We have been discussing it, and I've given my views. And in reviewing it, we'll come back with our position, hopefully before we resume.
That would be really useful. Thank you.
I think Mr. Kimbling.
Yes, Mr. Kimbling, you've just put your hand up. What would you like to comment on?
Well, just to add to what's already been said on this topic, in fact, both Mr. Banner and I spent time in the Court of Appeal during the course of the last term, tangling with the interaction between what's effectively the framework and Section 38.6. And really, you've identified the same problem which frankly foxes the Court of Appeal in what you do if you've got a policy which is in fact a decision-making framework, which is replicating in part what is law and in part what is national policy. And I'm just speaking in support of what has been said by both you, Madam, and by Mr. Shadovarian, that really one, for the user of this document, arrives at something which is rather confusing, and for legal users of it, immensely confusing, because you're stuck between development plan policy, the effect of Section 38.6, and national policy. So its status as a policy in the development plan is, as you observe, somewhat unhelpful.
Thank you for that. I also would just caution the inclusion of the words of sort of picking up the policy and then just putting it into the justification text. Just have a look at some of the wording on that to ensure that there is an element of consistency. Obviously, if it's not within the policy, that helps. But it would be useful. I know I think you're talking here under criterion DD, I think. No, is it DD? It's one of the criteria. Bear with me. It's where yes, under D, criterion D, you talk about development will be supported and is considered to contribute towards delivering the strategic objectives. So even if that is not in policy, which that's not effective as it's worded, because it doesn't, there is no way of clarifying how a developer can ensure that they're delivering the strategic objectives. That's not clear. Can you just ensure that any text that you do move from there within the justification text, you do clarify those points as to how somebody can ensure that they are meeting the strategic objectives? That's what I'm trying to get at.
I accept fully that some of the wording here is inappropriate and ineffective and unnecessary. And when it's moved, if we propose to move it to the supporting text, it will be cogent.
I appreciate that, Mr. Shedaravian. That's really, really helpful to us. Thank you very much for that. Now, on that note, Mr. Warden, is there anything further you would like to, or any other questions or notes that you've made that you would like to query in relation to matter 2 before I bring everything to a close?
No, Mrs. Wright, thank you.
Thank you. Right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That's been a very useful session. I know that there are some outstanding matters and issues that we need to deal with, but we won't be giving any formal directions or anything like that at this stage. We have to hear the rest of the strategic issues and matters, and even some of the site allocation issues and that, before we make any particular judgments, etc. In relation to duty to cooperate, we won't be making a sort of a decision about that. I know whether we move forward, because I know we haven't said whether the council has met or has not met the duty to cooperate. If we find there are issues, then we will inform the council prior to going to the hearing sessions in February. But that's an if at this stage. We're not saying that we have issues on that at the moment. It's something that we very much need to discuss. We need to take on board all of the comments that we heard yesterday. So I just wanted to make that that point clear, because I don't think I made that yesterday when we were actually going through those sessions. So on that note, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your contributions today. And we will start back again tomorrow at 9:30, where Mr. Warden will be dealing with the housing needs and housing requirement. Thank you.
Thank you.